The city of Moscow at night is a study in contrasts. Streetlights flicker over silent cobblestones, casting long shadows that stretch into the darkness like reaching fingers. The cold air carries the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a stray dog, but underneath this calm surface, a pulse of tension runs through the city, a rhythm dictated not by law or government, but by unseen forces operating in the shadows. It is here, in this delicate balance between light and dark, order and chaos, that the story of Serhiy Mikhailov begins, a man who would rise to become one of the most feared and respected figures in the Bratva, Moscow's notorious criminal underworld. From the very first whispers of his name, there was a sense of intrigue surrounding him. Those who spoke of him in the dimly lit corners of cafes or behind closed doors spoke in hushed tones, their words carrying equal parts fear and admiration. To outsiders, he was a mystery, a shadow among shadows, his movements barely noticed until it was far too late to avoid their consequences. For those within his circle, he was a calculating mind, capable of seeing patterns and possibilities that others could not. And for the city itself, he was a force that would quietly shape its streets, its markets, and even its institutions, all without the glare of public recognition. Mikhailov's story is not one of sudden power or effortless dominance. It is a narrative born from necessity, ambition, and a cold intelligence honed in the hidden alleys and forgotten neighborhoods of post-Soviet Moscow. The streets taught him lessons that no school could offer: how to read a person's intentions from the flicker in their eyes, how to measure loyalty in silences rather than words, and how to navigate a world where the line between friend and foe is often invisible. It is this foundation, built in obscurity and shadow, that would allow him to rise above rivals and enemies alike, carving out a place for himself in a world where survival depended on both fear and respect. The night carries a strange clarity, a quiet observance that seems to acknowledge the presence of men like Mikhailov. He moved with purpose, even when unnoticed, understanding that the true measure of power lies in subtlety and discretion. Unlike those who flaunt authority, those who shout their dominance, Mikhailov understood the art of invisibility, the ability to influence events without ever appearing to do so. It is a quality that separates legends from mere criminals. In this way, he was already a step ahead of the world around him, a silent strategist in a city that could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful. But even as the calm of the night enveloped Moscow, there were currents of danger beneath the surface. Rival factions, opportunists, and even law enforcement existed in this ecosystem, each aware that power was never static. For every street under Mikhailov's control, there were others teetering on the edge of chaos, waiting for the slightest lapse in judgment to seize an advantage. This tension, the quiet hum of threats that never fully materialize, would follow him throughout his rise. It is a tension that makes the story of his life not only compelling but also deeply human, the balance between control and uncertainty, between ambition and vulnerability. Mikhailov's emergence into the criminal world would be gradual but undeniable. It began not with violence or notoriety, but with observation, patience, and calculated risk. He learned to measure every word, every glance, every hesitation, turning what others might consider weakness into strength. To those watching from the outside, he may have appeared calm, even unremarkable. But beneath the surface, a mind was at work, plotting, calculating, anticipating the movements of both allies and enemies. Every encounter, every decision, became a building block in the architecture of power he was quietly assembling. And yet, there is something almost paradoxical about the quiet rise of a man like Mikhailov. The very patience and subtlety that made him so effective also cloaked him in mystery. Few knew his true intentions, fewer still understood the scope of his ambitions. To the uninitiated, he was simply another face in the crowd, another shadow passing through Moscow's streets. But for those attuned to the rhythm of the city, there was a signal, a sense that a force was gathering, one that would soon make its presence unmistakably felt. As we step into the story of Serhiy Mikhailov, it is important to remember this duality, the calm and the tension, the visible and the hidden, the legend and the man. His life is a journey through a city that is both familiar and alien, a place where loyalty is currency and fear is a tool. Each street, each dimly lit corner, each quiet encounter contributes to the shaping of a man who would eventually command respect and terror in equal measure. This is a story not only of crime and ambition but of human psychology, strategy, and the delicate interplay between power and perception. As you listen, allow yourself to wander through the streets of Moscow at night, to see the city not just as it is, but as it was seen through the eyes of a man who would make it his kingdom. And as we begin, consider the question that hangs quietly in the air: how does one rise from obscurity to rule over the shadows themselves, and what does it cost along the way? The story of Serhiy Mikhailov's early life begins far from the neon-lit streets of Moscow, in neighborhoods where the remnants of the Soviet Union lingered in crumbling buildings and quiet courtyards. He was born into a world shaped by scarcity, uncertainty, and the unspoken rules of survival. Even as a child, the patterns of the streets were more instructive than any schoolroom, and every day offered lessons in observation, patience, and the delicate art of assessing others. For many, childhood is a time of carefreeness, but for Serhiy, the world demanded attention to detail, a constant awareness of both danger and opportunity. The neighborhoods of his youth were a patchwork of faded brick apartment blocks, narrow alleyways, and abandoned playgrounds where children learned resilience alongside games. The sounds of the city, the distant clang of factory machinery, the rhythmic rumble of trams, the occasional shout from a neighbor, formed the soundtrack of his early years. It was in these spaces that Serhiy first observed human behavior in its rawest form, the ways people protected themselves, the gestures of intimidation, and the silent agreements that governed interactions. These small observations, almost imperceptible to others, would later become the foundation of his understanding of power, influence, and control. Family life, while not devoid of warmth, was marked by struggle. Resources were limited, and expectations were high. His parents, like many in that era, were shaped by hardship, carrying both the resilience and the scars of a country transitioning through chaos. Serhiy learned early that survival required strategy, and that loyalty and trust were valuable, fragile commodities. Quiet moments at home, sharing meals, listening to stories of older relatives, or watching neighbors navigate conflicts, taught him more about human nature than any classroom lesson ever could. Each conversation, each glance, each subtle gesture was catalogued in his mind, forming a map of understanding that would guide him in the years to come. School offered its own lessons, though of a different kind. It was a place where hierarchy, reputation, and alliances were formed almost instinctively. Serhiy quickly realized that intelligence alone could only carry a person so far. The ability to read others, to sense intentions and manipulate perception, was equally critical. Teachers might have noticed his sharp mind, but it was the street, not the curriculum, that sharpened his instincts. Every scuffle, every dispute, every whispered threat was a small training ground for the skills that would eventually serve him in the Bratva. The environment around him was often unforgiving. Older boys tested boundaries, gangs roamed local streets, and the specter of crime was never far away. For many children, this might have been a source of fear, but for Serhiy, it became a world of opportunity. He observed, learned, and, when necessary, acted. Small acts of cunning, minor thefts, or clever manipulations earned him respect in local circles, and slowly, his reputation began to form. It was a reputation built not on brute strength alone, but on the quiet calculation, the anticipation of consequences, and the understanding that every action carries a ripple effect. Yet even amid these challenges, there were moments of normalcy, glimpses of the ordinary that shaped his humanity. The laughter of friends on the streets, the small victories of schoolwork, or the fleeting joys of family celebrations provided a counterbalance to the harsh lessons of the world around him. These moments, though brief, were not insignificant. They instilled in him the capacity for patience, empathy, and emotional intelligence, qualities that would later prove invaluable as he navigated the treacherous waters of organized crime. It was also during these formative years that Serhiy developed an almost instinctive understanding of perception and influence. He learned that appearances could be manipulated, that fear and respect could be earned through subtlety rather than force, and that timing was as critical as action. In quiet corners, he would observe interactions between adults, noting who commanded authority and how it was maintained. He understood early on that the world is rarely fair, but it rewards those who can see its patterns and adapt accordingly. These early experiences were further shaped by the broader context of post-Soviet society. The collapse of old structures, the uncertainty of governance, and the rapid transformation of Moscow and nearby regions created a sense of instability that pervaded daily life. Crime and corruption were no longer anomalies, they were part of the environment, part of the invisible architecture of survival. For a young mind like Serhiy's, this environment was both a challenge and a classroom, offering lessons in strategy, negotiation, and self-preservation that would later define his approach to power. By the time he approached adolescence, it was clear that Serhiy possessed a combination of intelligence, intuition, and audacity that set him apart from his peers. He was cautious yet daring, observant yet ready to act. The streets had taught him that opportunity often comes disguised as risk, and that one must be willing to navigate discomfort to achieve advancement. These early instincts, the ability to calculate, anticipate, and act with precision, would become the cornerstones of his rise within the Bratva, long before he would command loyalty, respect, and fear on a much larger stage. Even in the quietest moments, the young Serhiy seemed aware of the currents of power and influence swirling around him. Each observation, each small maneuver, each test of courage or wit contributed to a growing understanding of the world as a game of cause and effect, of subtle dominance and silent negotiation. And though he could not yet have known the full scope of his future, the foundation was firmly in place, a mind attuned to strategy, a heart tempered by circumstance, and a resilience that would carry him through the dangers and intrigues awaiting him in the adult world. In the streets of his youth, in the quiet moments at home, and in the unspoken lessons of survival, the young Serhiy Mikhailov was already being shaped into a figure capable of navigating shadows, commanding loyalty, and ultimately transforming Moscow itself. The calm observer would become a man of influence, the careful student a master strategist, and the boy from forgotten neighborhoods a name whispered in fear and respect across the city. This early life, rich with subtle lessons and quiet victories, set the stage for a journey into a world where power, ambition, and danger intertwined in ways that few could comprehend. As Serhiy Mikhailov moved from the tentative years of adolescence into the uncertain realm of young adulthood, the streets that had taught him so much began to offer new lessons in risk, ambition, and consequence. The neighborhood, with its faded brick buildings and narrow alleys, was no longer simply a backdrop to his youth, it became a classroom, a proving ground where observation alone was not enough. Action, decisiveness, and cunning were required to navigate the complex web of human interaction and survival. His first steps into crime were subtle, almost imperceptible, but each small decision carried weight. Minor thefts, quick exchanges of money for favors, and small acts of cunning allowed him to test boundaries, gauge reactions, and understand the subtleties of influence. These were not reckless ventures, they were calculated experiments, each designed to measure both risk and reward. The calmness with which he approached each situation, combined with an innate ability to read others, set him apart from many of his peers. Where others might act impulsively or be blinded by emotion, Serhiy moved with patience, considering each angle and anticipating consequences. One of the earliest lessons of the criminal world is that loyalty is fragile and respect must be earned. In his first encounters with older gang members and street-level operators, Serhiy learned to navigate these dynamics carefully. He observed the ways in which reputation could be manipulated, how perception often mattered more than action, and how subtle gestures, a nod, a glance, or a well-timed silence, could convey strength far more effectively than overt aggression. These small, almost invisible actions were the building blocks of the psychological understanding that would later define his approach to power. It was also during this period that mentorship began to shape him. Certain figures in the neighborhood, older men with experience in both legitimate work and illicit dealings, took notice of Serhiy's intelligence and composure. Unlike the brash, reckless youths around him, he listened, observed, and learned. They imparted lessons not just in practical matters, how to move undetected, how to negotiate, how to defend oneself, but also in the subtler arts of influence, timing, persuasion, and the cultivation of fear and respect. Each encounter, each piece of advice, was absorbed and catalogued, forming a mental map that would guide him through increasingly dangerous territory. The street became a mirror for understanding human behavior. Serhiy noted patterns of greed, ambition, and fear in those around him. He understood early that power was rarely absolute, it was a balance maintained by perception, intimidation, and the careful orchestration of opportunity. While some of his peers relied on physical prowess or impulsive bravado, he relied on observation, intellect, and a quiet audacity. Every small miscalculation by others became a lesson, every misstep a warning, and every success a confirmation of method. As his reputation grew, so too did the scale of his actions. Petty thefts evolved into more organized operations, running errands for small-time criminals, acting as a messenger between factions, and performing discreet tasks that required discretion and reliability. Each successful task expanded both his skill set and his network, bringing him into contact with increasingly influential figures in the local underworld. The calm precision with which he executed these assignments set him apart and earned him respect, while also subtly signaling to rivals that he was not a youth to be underestimated. Yet, the allure of crime was not without danger. Close calls, street fights, and encounters with law enforcement punctuated this period, each incident reinforcing lessons in vigilance and strategy. Mikhailov learned to read the environment, to anticipate threats before they emerged, and to respond in ways that minimized exposure while maximizing effect. The stakes were growing, but so too was his confidence and understanding of the rules governing this hidden world. Even amidst the tension, there were moments of clarity and reflection. Serhiy began to perceive patterns beyond immediate survival, the way power shifted between factions, the subtle negotiations that kept rivalries in check, and the importance of alliances built on mutual benefit rather than mere fear. He realized that physical dominance could only carry one so far, influence, cunning, and foresight were far more valuable currencies. These insights were critical, planting the seeds for a rise that would extend far beyond the streets of his neighborhood. One of the most defining aspects of this period was the delicate balance between audacity and patience. Serhiy was willing to take calculated risks, but he never acted without thought. Each action was measured against possible outcomes, and each decision considered not just immediate gain but long-term consequences. This careful, methodical approach earned him both opportunities and protection. Older, more established criminals began to see him not as a threat, but as an asset, someone capable of navigating complex situations with intelligence and discretion. By the time he was fully immersed in this world, Serhiy had developed a reputation that combined reliability, cunning, and ambition. He was no longer merely a participant in the criminal landscape, he was an observer, a strategist, and an emerging force whose decisions carried weight. People began to notice the subtle ways he influenced outcomes without ever appearing to dominate. He understood the importance of perception, that a well-placed word, a timely absence, or a display of calm under pressure could accomplish more than direct confrontation ever could. This period, seemingly defined by small acts and incremental victories, laid the groundwork for what would later become a meticulously crafted rise within the Bratva. Every lesson absorbed, every small risk taken, every carefully executed task contributed to the mental and emotional toolkit that would serve him throughout his life. The streets of his youth were both harsh and instructive, and in navigating them, Serhiy Mikhailov was quietly constructing the foundation of an empire. By the end of these formative years, he was no longer merely a boy of the streets. He was a young man with vision, intelligence, and a capacity for strategy that few could rival. The first steps into crime had been successful not because of force, but because of foresight, subtlety, and an uncanny ability to anticipate the moves of others. He had learned the early lessons of power, that observation can be as deadly as action, that loyalty must be cultivated, and that even the smallest victory can shape the course of an entire life. And though he could not yet have known the full scope of his future, the trajectory was clear, the boy who had learned from shadows was destined to step into the light of power. By the time Serhiy Mikhailov reached the threshold of adulthood, the streets had already taught him lessons that few could survive without scars. But there was a world beyond petty thefts and neighborhood disputes, a world of structure, hierarchy, and opportunity that only those who understood strategy and subtlety could navigate. This was the world of the Bratva, Moscow's organized criminal elite, a secretive and deadly society where loyalty was currency, fear was a tool, and a single misstep could mean permanent exile, or worse. To outsiders, joining such an organization might seem terrifying, but for a young man who had already mastered the art of observation and manipulation, it was the next natural step. Serhiy's introduction to the Bratva was not marked by fanfare or ceremony. There were no announcements, no public initiation. Instead, it began with careful observation and small, deliberate actions that showcased his reliability, intelligence, and discretion. He learned quickly that the Bratva was a world governed not by brute strength alone, but by a combination of reputation, strategic alliances, and an almost instinctive understanding of human behavior. Every handshake, every whispered word, every silent agreement carried weight. Here, appearances could deceive, but subtle cues betrayed intention, and Serhiy had become a master at reading both. His first tasks within the organization were modest yet revealing. He served as a messenger, a watcher, a discreet intermediary, roles that required precision, patience, and calm under pressure. These early responsibilities allowed him to observe the internal workings of the Bratva, the distribution of power, the subtle rivalries, the quiet tests of loyalty. In these moments, Serhiy demonstrated not just competence, but an innate ability to navigate social currents that others found perilous. He understood the delicate balance of asserting capability without threatening those already in power, a skill that would become one of his defining traits. The culture of the Bratva itself was layered, steeped in ritual, tradition, and unspoken codes. Loyalty was tested constantly, not merely through words but through action, endurance, and discretion. Betrayal carried consequences severe enough to serve as a cautionary tale for generations. Violence was never gratuitous, it was a tool employed with precision, a method of asserting authority and maintaining order. Within this structure, Serhiy found a stage upon which his skills could flourish. He observed the hierarchy, recognized the subtle shifts of influence, and began to position himself strategically, always mindful of both opportunity and risk. It was during this period that he began to cultivate a reputation not merely for efficiency, but for intelligence and foresight. Colleagues and superiors alike noticed his ability to anticipate problems, resolve conflicts without unnecessary exposure, and maintain composure even under pressure. Where others relied on intimidation or brute force, Serhiy relied on observation, logic, and timing. He understood the power of calmness in a world defined by volatility, a serenity that unnerved rivals and reassured allies. Gradually, he became someone whose decisions mattered, whose opinion carried weight, and whose presence commanded quiet respect. Rival factions and competing interests within the Bratva made advancement a delicate process. Serhiy had to learn not only to earn trust, but also to navigate jealousy and suspicion. Alliances were never permanent, friends could become foes with the turn of a word, and every act of loyalty was a calculated risk. Yet he thrived in this environment, understanding that the key to influence lay in both consistency and unpredictability, being reliable when expected, but clever enough to shift strategy when circumstances demanded. Each success, each small demonstration of skill or discretion, slowly built his credibility and expanded his sphere of influence. By working quietly and methodically, Serhiy also developed a network of relationships both within and beyond the Bratva. Trusted allies became advisors, informants, and collaborators, each connection carefully nurtured to ensure mutual benefit. He learned the value of perception, understanding that power often depended as much on being seen as capable as on actual capability. In the subtle world of organized crime, a reputation could open doors, close conflicts, and protect one from the unexpected dangers that lurked in the shadows. One of the most defining moments of his early Bratva experience was the realization that fear could be wielded without overt violence. By observing, predicting, and occasionally intervening in critical situations, Serhiy demonstrated a quiet dominance that both intimidated rivals and reinforced loyalty among his allies. He understood that influence was often more powerful than coercion, that a strategic word or a well-timed silence could achieve what an act of aggression could not. In this way, he distinguished himself as more than just another foot soldier. He was becoming a tactician, a strategist, a mind capable of shaping events far beyond his immediate actions. Yet, even as he ascended quietly, he remained aware of the dangers inherent in the Bratva. Jealousies, rivalries, and the constant presence of law enforcement formed a backdrop of tension that never fully dissipated. Each decision, each move, carried weight and potential consequences. Serhiy learned to anticipate threats not only from enemies but from within his own organization, understanding that the most dangerous rival could be one's closest ally if perception of weakness appeared. It was a constant exercise in vigilance, patience, and psychological acuity. By the time Serhiy Mikhailov was fully integrated into the Bratva, he had already begun to transform from an observer of the streets into a participant in a far more intricate and deadly game. The lessons of his childhood, the calculated risks of his early crimes, and the careful cultivation of relationships converged to create a foundation of both respect and quiet fear. He was no longer simply a young man from the neighborhoods, he was an emerging force, a presence whose influence would soon ripple far beyond the hidden corners of Moscow. As he continued to navigate this complex world, the balance of loyalty and fear, patience and action, observation and intervention became second nature. Serhiy understood that his rise would require not only intelligence and cunning, but also a deep understanding of human nature, perception, and timing. And though his journey had only just begun, the groundwork was firmly laid, a young man poised at the edge of power, ready to step into a world where every choice mattered, and where the subtle art of strategy could determine life, death, and legacy. Even as Serhiy Mikhailov settled into the world of the Bratva, he quickly learned that belonging did not guarantee safety. The underworld, as he had already begun to understand, was a place of constant flux. Alliances were fragile, rivalries simmered beneath polite conversation, and loyalty, while demanded, was rarely absolute. The streets of Moscow taught lessons in vigilance and cunning, but within the Bratva, the stakes were infinitely higher. One misjudgment, one poorly timed action, or one misplaced word could unravel years of carefully built reputation. Serhiy, however, had learned early to navigate such treacherous waters with a combination of patience, observation, and calculated audacity. Rival factions within the city's criminal ecosystem quickly became apparent to him. These were not merely groups of desperate men seeking territory, they were organized, disciplined, and equally intelligent players in a high-stakes game of influence and survival. From the shadowy corners of taverns to the back rooms of bustling markets, Serhiy observed the subtle signs of tension, gestures that betrayed suspicion, sudden changes in tone, and fleeting glances that carried unspoken warnings. Each encounter was a lesson in human behavior, and he catalogued each subtle cue, understanding that perception was often more powerful than brute force. His early rivalries were not always violent. In many cases, they began with whispers, challenges to authority, or small acts designed to test his mettle. Younger members of competing factions would seek to provoke him, testing his patience, his intelligence, and his ability to respond without creating unnecessary enemies. Serhiy's approach was methodical, he never reacted impulsively. Instead, he measured the intentions of each adversary, gauged the risks, and chose responses that maximized advantage while minimizing exposure. These encounters gradually built his reputation as a strategist, someone who could outthink and outmaneuver rivals rather than relying solely on intimidation or violence. Street-level skirmishes and confrontations were inevitable, however. In one early incident, a dispute over territory could have escalated into a larger conflict, but Serhiy's calm intervention and subtle maneuvering diffused the situation before blood was shed. He understood the value of restraint, of timing, and of the psychological impact of carefully executed gestures. To his adversaries, it became clear that Serhiy was not simply another competitor, he was a calculated presence, someone who assessed every variable before acting, and who had the patience to wait for the most advantageous moment to strike. At the same time, these rivalries provided opportunities for him to consolidate influence. Allies of convenience, mentors, and even cautious observers became part of a network that Serhiy nurtured carefully. He learned the importance of small favors, strategic alliances, and selective generosity, tools that could secure loyalty, create indebtedness, or subtly shift power balances in his favor. Every interaction was a potential calculation, every exchange an opportunity to strengthen his position or gather intelligence on potential threats. The tension between ambition and caution was never more evident than in encounters with older, more experienced members of the Bratva. Some viewed him as an upstart, a young man overstepping boundaries, while others recognized his potential. Serhiy navigated this landscape by blending humility with quiet confidence. He deferred when necessary, observed the hierarchy carefully, and waited for moments when his talents could be demonstrated without unnecessary risk. This careful balancing act allowed him to survive, and even thrive, in an environment where overreach could be fatal. His ability to read human behavior became his greatest asset. In rival factions, he noticed subtle signs of weakness, a moment of hesitation, a flicker of fear, or overconfidence in the wrong situation. Against these indicators, he could plan interventions, manipulate outcomes, and position himself advantageously. He understood that true power did not come from defeating rivals in open conflict alone, it came from anticipating their moves, shaping perception, and influencing decisions before they even materialized. This strategic foresight, already evident in his early interactions, would become a defining trait in his rise through the Bratva. Even in moments of apparent calm, the stakes remained high. Every street, every building, and every corner of Moscow carried potential threats. Serhiy developed routines, habits, and methods of observation that allowed him to remain one step ahead. He learned to trust his instincts while verifying them with careful observation, to act decisively when required, and to retreat when prudence dictated. In doing so, he cultivated a reputation not only for skill but for an almost uncanny awareness of danger, a trait that drew both admiration and caution from those around him. These early rivalries, while challenging, were instrumental in shaping his character. They honed his patience, strengthened his strategic thinking, and reinforced the importance of subtlety over brute force. Serhiy's rise within the Bratva was not merely a function of ambition, it was the result of disciplined preparation, careful calculation, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics with grace and precision. Every confrontation, every test of loyalty, and every skirmish contributed to the gradual consolidation of his influence. By the end of this period, it was evident that Serhiy Mikhailov was no longer a newcomer to the streets or to the Bratva. He had transitioned from observer to strategist, from participant to influential player. His rivals, once indifferent or dismissive, now regarded him with caution, understanding that he was a mind capable of both foresight and subtle manipulation. The lessons learned from these early conflicts, the importance of patience, the power of perception, and the value of strategic alliances, would serve as the foundation for his continued ascent, preparing him for the larger challenges and greater stakes that awaited in his journey toward dominance in Moscow's criminal world. Within the intricate web of Moscow's criminal underworld, Serhiy Mikhailov began to emerge not merely as a participant, but as a mind capable of shaping outcomes with precision and foresight. It was one thing to survive the streets and navigate rivalries, it was another to understand patterns, anticipate moves, and orchestrate events in a manner that elevated one above peers. This was the subtle art of strategy, and Serhiy quickly demonstrated an aptitude that set him apart from those around him. Unlike impulsive actors who relied on brute force, he approached every challenge as a calculated exercise, measuring risks, gauging reactions, and envisioning consequences several steps ahead. His strategic genius was not born overnight. It was honed through years of observation, trial, and reflection, cultivated in the quiet moments between action and consequence. He learned that timing could be as decisive as action itself, that a word, gesture, or absence could achieve what violence alone could not. Small victories were often more instructive than major confrontations, teaching him how to influence situations subtly, sway decisions, and consolidate influence without drawing attention to his hand. It was a skill that required patience, a calm mind, and the ability to resist the temptation of immediate gratification. One of Serhiy's earliest demonstrations of this strategic thinking involved the delicate balancing of loyalty and intimidation. He understood that fear, when applied indiscriminately, could breed resentment and betrayal. Conversely, earned respect could create loyalty that endured far longer than any threat of violence. He began to cultivate a reputation for fairness within the confines of the underworld, delivering on promises, punishing only when necessary, and carefully choosing when to exert authority. By observing reactions, calculating probabilities, and intervening only when optimal, he built influence without unnecessary risk, demonstrating a mastery of power that extended beyond physical dominance. The intelligence with which he approached operations was equally remarkable. Smuggling routes, clandestine financial arrangements, and alliances with both criminals and corrupt officials required careful planning, foresight, and discretion. Serhiy approached each task as a puzzle, analyzing variables, predicting obstacles, and positioning himself to capitalize on every opportunity. He recognized that information was as valuable as muscle, and he cultivated sources, observers, and intermediaries who could provide insight into both rivals and allies. Knowledge became his currency, enabling him to act decisively while others remained reactive. Equally important was his ability to manipulate perception. In a world where image could dictate influence, Serhiy carefully curated how he was seen by friends, foes, and the broader criminal ecosystem. He projected calm confidence, even in moments of danger, ensuring that uncertainty and hesitation were never visible. At the same time, he allowed subtle hints of unpredictability, calculated gestures or cryptic warnings, that suggested capability beyond what could be measured. By controlling perception, he could preempt challenges, deter aggression, and establish authority without overt confrontation. Serhiy's rise in influence was also shaped by his understanding of human psychology. He observed motivations, fears, and desires, tailoring interactions to exploit weaknesses or reinforce loyalty. Allies felt understood and respected, rivals felt measured and cautious, and subordinates recognized a leader whose intelligence was both tangible and enigmatic. This deep comprehension of behavior allowed him to orchestrate outcomes with minimal risk, turning potential threats into opportunities and transforming conflicts into advantages. Even as his strategic influence expanded, Serhiy remained mindful of the delicate nature of power. The Bratva was an ecosystem defined by constant vigilance, subtle rivalries, and the ever-present possibility of betrayal. One misstep could trigger a cascade of consequences, undermining months or years of careful planning. Yet he navigated this reality with patience and foresight, understanding that long-term success required discipline, resilience, and the restraint to act only when conditions were optimal. This temperament, rare among his peers, became a defining element of his authority. His strategic approach extended beyond immediate operations. Serhiy began to envision the broader architecture of influence, considering how alliances, rivalries, and operations interconnected across Moscow's criminal landscape. He identified vulnerabilities in rival networks, potential collaborators, and moments when intervention could shift balances of power in his favor. Each decision was weighted against both short-term gain and long-term stability, ensuring that his ascent was sustainable and resilient against disruption. This period also marked his subtle but deliberate accumulation of loyalty. Rather than relying on fear alone, he recognized that enduring influence required trust and a sense of mutual benefit. Those who worked with him learned that competence, discretion, and fairness would be rewarded, while recklessness and betrayal would be met with consequences, carefully measured, precise, and always proportionate. Through these calculated interactions, he created a network of allies who were both dependable and indebted, forming a foundation that would later support his broader ambitions. By the time he had fully established his early strategies, Serhiy Mikhailov was no longer simply a rising figure within the Bratva. He had become a strategist whose influence could subtly alter outcomes, whose foresight allowed him to anticipate and neutralize threats, and whose intelligence commanded respect without overt display of power. In a world defined by volatility and risk, he had mastered the quiet art of control, blending observation, planning, and psychological acuity to navigate a dangerous landscape with remarkable skill. These lessons, accumulated through careful study, observation, and practical application, laid the groundwork for the expansion of his empire. Each maneuver, each calculated risk, and each subtle demonstration of capability reinforced his position and extended his influence. By understanding not only the mechanics of power, but also the psychology of those around him, Serhiy had positioned himself to not merely survive the Bratva, but to shape it, to mold the organization in a way that would allow him to rise above rivals and command respect across Moscow's shadowed streets. In essence, this period of strategic mastery transformed Serhiy Mikhailov from a capable operative into a rising architect of power, a man whose mind was as formidable as any weapon, whose patience equaled his ambition, and whose foresight laid the foundation for an empire that would come to dominate the criminal landscape of Moscow. It was here, in the quiet calculation of moves unseen, that he began to define the scope of his future, preparing to extend his influence far beyond the immediate conflicts of the streets and into the broader theater of organized crime itself. As Serhiy Mikhailov's strategic influence solidified within the Bratva, he began to look beyond the confines of small operations and individual tasks. The streets, the neighborhoods, and even the hidden corners of Moscow were no longer simply arenas of survival, they were pieces of a larger game board, each territory, each alliance, and each rival a variable in a complex system of control. It was during this period that he began to transition from strategist to architect of power, carefully expanding his influence and consolidating control over key aspects of Moscow's criminal operations. The expansion was methodical, deliberate, and almost imperceptible to those not attuned to the subtleties of the Bratva. Serhiy avoided reckless aggression, understanding that overt displays of dominance often provoked backlash. Instead, he relied on observation, timing, and psychological insight to identify opportunities. Certain operations, protection rackets, small-scale smuggling, and clandestine exchanges, were targeted not merely for profit, but as a means of testing loyalty, measuring competence, and reinforcing his emerging authority. Each successful intervention reinforced his credibility, signaling to allies and adversaries alike that his influence extended far beyond the immediate actions. In consolidating power, Serhiy emphasized the importance of structure and hierarchy. He identified individuals capable of leadership and carefully positioned them in roles that would maximize efficiency while ensuring loyalty. Those who excelled were rewarded with responsibility and status, while those who faltered were quietly marginalized or reassigned. Through this method, he not only strengthened his operations but also demonstrated an early mastery of organizational control, an understanding that influence is most secure when the system itself is resilient and self-sustaining. Expansion also required a nuanced understanding of territory. Moscow, with its labyrinthine streets, markets, and districts, was a city of overlapping claims, rival interests, and historical grudges. Serhiy mapped these dynamics with precision, recognizing areas where influence could be asserted without igniting full-scale conflict and identifying moments where subtle intervention could tip the balance of power in his favor. By controlling key territories and maintaining discreet oversight of operations, he established a presence that was both pervasive and unobtrusive, a quiet assertion of authority that few could challenge openly. Financial acumen became another tool in his arsenal. Serhiy recognized that money was not merely a reward for operations, but a means of influence. Resources could secure loyalty, fund strategic maneuvers, and provide leverage over rivals. He implemented systems of accountability, oversight, and reward that ensured operations remained profitable while reinforcing his control. By marrying strategy with economics, he transformed seemingly isolated activities into a coherent framework of influence, one that could sustain expansion while mitigating risk. The psychological dimension of power remained central to his approach. Serhiy cultivated an aura of calm authority, projecting confidence even in uncertain situations. He allowed rumors, subtle gestures, and selective information to shape perception, creating an impression of omniscience without overt assertion. This careful orchestration of image and reality amplified his influence, as allies felt secure under his guidance and rivals hesitated, unsure of both his intentions and capabilities. In a world where uncertainty is weaponized, perception becomes as critical as action, and Serhiy had mastered both. Rival factions responded cautiously. Some attempted to test him, probing for weakness or vulnerability, but Serhiy anticipated these maneuvers. By acting with calculated timing, he neutralized challenges before they escalated and used minor confrontations to reinforce his authority. Each successful resolution strengthened his network of loyal operatives and demonstrated his capacity to manage complexity without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. His growing reputation as a decisive yet measured leader gradually extended across Moscow's underworld, earning him respect that was both earned and feared. Expansion also required careful management of internal loyalty. Serhiy understood that power is fragile when based solely on fear. While intimidation remained a tool, it was tempered by consistency, fairness, and reward. Those who worked under him learned that competence, discretion, and adherence to the unspoken rules of the Bratva would be recognized and rewarded. This cultivated a sense of trust that was rare in the criminal ecosystem, a trust that strengthened his operations and provided a foundation for further consolidation of authority. By the end of this period, Serhiy's presence in Moscow's criminal world had become unmistakable, even if subtle. He was no longer merely a rising strategist, he was an emerging power, capable of orchestrating operations, managing alliances, and influencing outcomes across multiple territories. The quiet patience and deliberate calculation that had defined his early years now translated into tangible control, allowing him to shape events rather than simply respond to them. Perhaps most importantly, this expansion marked a turning point in his personal evolution. Serhiy Mikhailov had transitioned from a young observer of streets and factions into a leader capable of managing complexity, anticipating threats, and consolidating influence with precision. His ascent was not fueled by reckless ambition, but by disciplined strategy, careful timing, and an understanding of the human and systemic dynamics that governed Moscow's criminal ecosystem. In this phase, the foundation was laid for his eventual dominance, a rise characterized not by noise or spectacle, but by methodical, almost invisible control. This stage of expansion also reinforced a crucial lesson: true power is cultivated, not seized. It requires patience, intelligence, and the ability to navigate both overt and hidden currents of influence. Serhiy's approach exemplified this principle, blending foresight, psychological acuity, and organizational skill to create a presence that was both formidable and resilient. By the time he had fully established control over key operations, he had not only secured his position but also demonstrated that leadership in the Bratva was not merely a matter of force, it was an art, one that Serhiy Mikhailov had begun to master with remarkable precision. In the quiet hours, when the city seemed still yet alive with unseen currents, Serhiy's influence extended in ways that were almost imperceptible. Each territory, each alliance, each operation he touched carried subtle marks of his control. Allies felt the security of clear direction, rivals felt the pressure of unseen oversight, and the network of loyalty and influence he cultivated continued to grow. This period of strategic expansion laid the groundwork for what would eventually become his full dominion over Moscow's criminal underworld, a rise defined by subtlety, foresight, and an almost unmatched ability to orchestrate complexity. As Serhiy Mikhailov's influence extended across Moscow, his presence became increasingly impossible to ignore. Where once he had moved quietly through the shadows, now his reputation began to radiate through the underworld, whispered in back rooms, marketplaces, and taverns. This was a rise not marked by spectacle but by subtle authority, a command that did not rely solely on intimidation, yet inspired both respect and caution. Those who encountered him, whether as allies, subordinates, or rivals, could sense a precision in his actions, a thoughtfulness that signaled a mind always several steps ahead. The early signs of notoriety were almost imperceptible, yet they carried weight. Rumors spread of his calculated interventions, his ability to resolve conflicts before escalation, and his talent for reading people with uncanny accuracy. Allies spoke of his fairness, his discipline, and his ability to reward loyalty without hesitation. Rivals, however, felt the quiet pressure of his strategic oversight, wary of provoking someone whose moves were measured and whose perception was acute. In this delicate balance, Serhiy learned one of the fundamental truths of power: influence is often more formidable when invisible, more persuasive when indirect, and more enduring when earned through precision rather than spectacle. With notoriety came opportunity, and risk. As word of his abilities spread, he was approached with increasingly complex operations that required discretion, foresight, and coordination across multiple layers of the Bratva. These tasks were not only tests of skill but also measures of trust. A wrong move could undermine his reputation, while a successful execution could elevate him further into the inner circles of power. Serhiy approached each challenge with the same methodical attention to detail that had defined his rise, analyzing risks, weighing outcomes, and preparing contingencies. His calm demeanor reassured allies and unsettled rivals, creating an aura of authority that extended beyond immediate actions. Rival factions, sensing his growing influence, began to respond with subtle probes, tests of loyalty, small provocations, and challenges to his authority. These encounters required careful navigation, as any miscalculation could trigger open conflict or internal dissent. Serhiy's approach was deliberate. He neither overreacted nor appeared weak. Instead, he observed, calculated, and executed responses that reinforced his position while minimizing exposure. Each engagement strengthened his reputation as a strategist whose patience and foresight surpassed the impulsiveness of others, and slowly, the perception of invincibility began to take hold. As his notoriety grew, so too did his ability to consolidate power. Serhiy understood that authority is strengthened not by fear alone, but by the careful orchestration of loyalty and influence. He cultivated relationships with trusted operatives, assigning responsibilities that not only rewarded competence but also reinforced a sense of obligation and mutual benefit. Subordinates learned that efficiency, discretion, and loyalty would be recognized, while recklessness or betrayal would be met with consequences, measured, precise, and fair. Through this careful cultivation, Serhiy built a network of dependable allies whose loyalty became a cornerstone of his growing empire. The psychological impact of his rise cannot be understated. Rivals, uncertain of his capabilities, hesitated to act, while potential allies weighed the benefits of alignment against the risks of defiance. Serhiy's quiet but deliberate presence created an environment in which perception became as critical as reality. Those who underestimated him quickly learned to reconsider, while those who respected him found guidance, opportunity, and security. His calculated balance of intimidation, respect, and foresight allowed him to extend influence across multiple factions without the need for constant confrontation. During this period, he also demonstrated a remarkable ability to capitalize on the weaknesses of others. Competitors often overextended, acted impulsively, or allowed personal grievances to cloud judgment, errors Serhiy quietly observed and later leveraged. Rather than seizing power through overt confrontation, he manipulated circumstances, alliances, and perceptions to consolidate control subtly and effectively. By guiding outcomes behind the scenes, he expanded his influence with minimal risk and maximum efficiency. Notoriety also brought a new dimension to his operations: the careful management of reputation beyond immediate circles. Serhiy understood that in a network as interconnected as Moscow's criminal ecosystem, a single misstep could reverberate across territories and factions. He monitored perceptions carefully, addressed grievances discreetly, and ensured that successes were recognized while failures were contained. This meticulous attention to image, combined with strategic action, amplified his authority and reinforced the sense that he was a figure whose reach extended far beyond visible actions. Yet, even as power and reputation grew, Serhiy remained vigilant. Moscow was a city of shifting alliances, hidden threats, and subtle rivalries, and the moment one grew complacent, danger could emerge. He continued to study human behavior, track movements, and anticipate challenges, ensuring that he remained several steps ahead of both allies and adversaries. This ongoing discipline allowed him not only to maintain authority but to expand it with confidence, carefully transforming notoriety into tangible control. By the end of this period, Serhiy Mikhailov had transitioned from a rising strategist to a recognized force within Moscow's underworld. His influence was visible yet subtle, feared yet respected, and his reach extended across multiple operations, territories, and factions. The foundations of his eventual dominion were firmly in place, a combination of strategic foresight, psychological insight, organizational control, and disciplined execution. Through methodical expansion, subtle intervention, and careful cultivation of loyalty, he had become a figure whose presence commanded attention, and whose future would come to reshape the criminal landscape of the city. As Serhiy Mikhailov's influence radiated through Moscow, the first significant tests of his authority began to emerge. Not all rivals were content to coexist quietly, and the more his reputation grew, the more others sought to probe for weakness. These early confrontations were subtle, measured, and often disguised as minor disputes, yet they carried immense potential consequences. Serhiy understood that a misstep could unravel years of careful planning, yet he also recognized these challenges as opportunities to solidify his dominance. Each confrontation would reveal not just the strength of his network, but the depth of his strategic mind. The early encounters with rival factions were rarely violent at first. They took the form of whispered threats, encroachment on territories, and subtle challenges to his authority. Competitors tested his patience, attempting to provoke mistakes that could be exploited. Serhiy's response was deliberate and measured. He observed, calculated, and waited for the precise moment to act. Rather than meeting aggression with aggression, he often diffused tensions with foresight, anticipating moves and positioning allies in ways that minimized risk while asserting subtle dominance. These early victories, executed quietly and efficiently, began to create a perception that he was untouchable, not through brute force, but through careful orchestration of events. In parallel, Serhiy began to refine his understanding of the human element in these confrontations. He noted the motivations of his rivals, their insecurities, their ambitions, and their fears. Some were driven by greed, others by pride, and many underestimated his intellect. By recognizing these patterns, he could predict behaviors and manipulate outcomes without engaging in open conflict. The brilliance of this approach was in its subtlety. Rivals often found themselves neutralized or co-opted without ever fully realizing the mechanism of his influence. It was a quiet assertion of power that left both allies reassured and competitors hesitant. At the same time, Serhiy began to extend his reach into new territories, consolidating control over previously contested areas through a combination of strategic alliances, carefully timed interventions, and the cultivation of loyalty. He understood that influence was not merely about territory or immediate gains, it was about embedding his authority into the structure of operations, ensuring that networks, informants, and key figures aligned with his vision. Each expansion was deliberate, tested for vulnerabilities, and executed with the precision of a strategist rather than the impulsiveness of a newcomer. The first major confrontations also revealed the necessity of balancing visibility with discretion. Serhiy was careful to avoid unnecessary displays of power, recognizing that overt action could provoke backlash or unite rival factions against him. Instead, he leveraged subtlety, a timely warning, a discreet intervention, or a calculated favor could achieve far more than overt confrontation. Allies saw him as decisive and capable, rivals perceived his reach and intelligence, and the perception of omnipresence, though never fully accurate, became a psychological tool as powerful as any weapon. These early conflicts also tested his ability to maintain internal loyalty. As challenges arose, he ensured that his operatives and allies understood the stakes and the necessity of discretion. Competence, loyalty, and adherence to protocol were rewarded, while recklessness or disloyalty was addressed with quiet but firm measures. This careful management reinforced the internal cohesion of his network, ensuring that his influence was both resilient and sustainable. By the time rivals realized the scope of his authority, Serhiy had already secured the internal stability necessary to withstand external pressures. Financial maneuvering became another key element in these confrontations. Control over resources, whether through protection schemes, smuggling, or discreet investments, provided leverage over both allies and adversaries. Serhiy recognized that money could consolidate loyalty, fund strategic interventions, and create dependencies that reinforced his influence. Each financial decision was carefully calculated, ensuring that it strengthened his position while remaining invisible to potential challengers. The combination of financial acumen, strategic foresight, and psychological insight allowed him to navigate complex confrontations with minimal risk. As these early confrontations intensified, Serhiy began to establish a pattern of influence that would define his leadership: subtle dominance, meticulous preparation, and an almost invisible orchestration of events. He intervened only when necessary, used discretion as a tool, and allowed perception to amplify his authority. Rivals who might have challenged him openly found themselves neutralized not through direct conflict, but through the quiet manipulation of circumstances, alliances, and timing. By turning confrontation into opportunity, he strengthened both his reputation and his actual control. Perhaps most importantly, these experiences honed his understanding of long-term strategy. Immediate victories were valuable, but Serhiy always considered the ripple effects of his actions across Moscow's criminal landscape. By anticipating reactions, preempting alliances, and managing perception, he ensured that each confrontation not only resolved immediate challenges but also reinforced his broader influence. The combination of foresight, patience, and psychological insight allowed him to expand his empire while minimizing exposure to risk, laying the groundwork for the dominance that would come to define his career. By the end of this period, Serhiy Mikhailov had transformed from a rising strategist into a figure whose authority was felt across Moscow. Rivals approached him with caution, allies moved with confidence, and the network of influence he had cultivated continued to expand quietly yet inexorably. Each early confrontation, executed with precision and foresight, served as both a test and a foundation, preparing him for the even greater challenges, risks, and triumphs that lay ahead. His ability to orchestrate power subtly, to manipulate perception, and to consolidate loyalty without unnecessary conflict marked him as a master tactician, and as a figure whose rise would reshape the criminal landscape of the city for years to come. With the early confrontations behind him, Serhiy Mikhailov entered a critical phase, the first major consolidation of power over Moscow's rival factions. By now, his reputation had begun to precede him, a quiet yet unmistakable presence that commanded both respect and caution. Competitors who had once tested his patience now approached with hesitation, uncertain of his capabilities but aware of his influence. Serhiy understood that consolidation was not achieved through brute force alone, it required psychological acuity, meticulous planning, and the careful orchestration of events that would leave rivals aligned, neutralized, or dependent. The process of consolidation was gradual, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. Serhiy's interventions were rarely overt, they manifested as subtle negotiations, strategic alliances, and the selective placement of loyal operatives in positions of influence. Through these measures, he began to exert control over key operations and territories previously contested by rival factions. Small victories accumulated into larger gains, each reinforcing his authority while minimizing exposure to unnecessary conflict. Allies recognized the fairness and foresight behind his actions, while adversaries realized the difficulty of challenging a mind that anticipated every move. Key to this consolidation was his understanding of perception. Serhiy recognized that power in the Bratva was as much about how one was seen as what one could accomplish. By projecting calm authority, responding decisively yet subtly to threats, and carefully curating his image, he created an aura of influence that extended beyond tangible operations. Allies felt secure under his guidance, competitors hesitated to challenge him openly, and the perception of omniscience became a psychological tool that amplified his control. It was a quiet dominance, achieved not through intimidation alone, but through the orchestration of reality and perception in tandem. Financial strategy also played a crucial role. Serhiy ensured that control over resources was both practical and symbolic. Profitable operations were aligned under his direction, generating loyalty through opportunity while reinforcing dependence among those who sought to benefit from his network. This careful allocation of wealth, influence, and opportunity created interdependencies that stabilized his consolidation efforts. In essence, those who thrived did so under his guidance, while those who resisted found themselves increasingly isolated and disadvantaged. Rival factions were gradually absorbed or neutralized through a combination of diplomacy and strategic pressure. Serhiy rarely resorted to open violence unless absolutely necessary, preferring to exploit existing tensions, rivalries, or ambitions to achieve compliance. In some cases, he offered mutually beneficial arrangements, turning potential adversaries into allies or collaborators. In others, careful interventions exposed vulnerabilities that made resistance impractical. Each encounter was a demonstration of his ability to manipulate the landscape of power subtly and efficiently, reinforcing the perception of his dominance across Moscow's criminal ecosystem. During this period, Serhiy also focused on strengthening internal cohesion. He recognized that consolidation could falter if internal loyalty was unstable. By cultivating trust, rewarding competence, and addressing breaches of discipline decisively yet proportionately, he ensured that his operatives were both capable and dependable. Subordinates understood the rules of engagement, the importance of discretion, and the benefits of alignment with his vision. This internal stability provided the foundation upon which external consolidation could proceed without fear of sudden disruption from within. Strategic foresight remained central to every action. Serhiy anticipated the ripple effects of each consolidation effort, calculating how alliances, rivalries, and public perception would interact over time. He avoided shortcuts that offered immediate gain but carried long-term risk, instead prioritizing durable influence that could withstand challenges, betrayal, or unexpected events. Each decision was weighed not only for its immediate impact but for how it would shape the evolving landscape of Moscow's criminal underworld. Psychology was intertwined with strategy. Serhiy understood that fear, respect, and loyalty were interconnected, and he employed each in measured doses. Minor displays of authority reminded rivals of his presence, while consistent fairness and recognition cultivated loyalty among allies. By blending these elements, he created an environment in which challenges were anticipated, influence was reinforced, and the balance of power shifted increasingly in his favor. The subtlety of this approach was critical. Overt displays could provoke resistance, while nuanced orchestration ensured long-term control. As consolidation progressed, Serhiy also began to extend his influence into areas previously beyond immediate operations. He established networks that allowed him to monitor rival activities, anticipate conflicts, and intervene discreetly when necessary. Intelligence became both shield and sword, protecting him from unforeseen threats while providing leverage to shape outcomes before they became critical. Through these measures, he moved from localized control to systemic influence, subtly embedding his authority into the very fabric of Moscow's criminal landscape. By the end of this phase, the first major consolidation of power was complete. Serhiy Mikhailov had transitioned from a rising strategist into a commanding presence whose influence extended across multiple factions, territories, and operations. Rivals approached with caution, allies moved with confidence, and the perception of his strategic genius was firmly established. This period laid the foundation for the next stage of his ascent, not merely consolidating power, but actively shaping the structure, operations, and hierarchy of Moscow's criminal empire with foresight, subtlety, and an almost unrivaled understanding of human and systemic dynamics. With the consolidation of rival factions underway, Serhiy Mikhailov turned his attention to the criminal economy of Moscow, understanding that real power extended beyond mere control of people and territory. It required mastery over resources, operations, and the flows of influence that sustained the underworld. The city was a labyrinth of opportunities and threats, from illicit markets to hidden smuggling routes, from gambling dens to protection schemes. Serhiy approached each as a strategic puzzle, carefully analyzing where his influence could be expanded, where loyalty could be leveraged, and where rival vulnerabilities could be exploited. One of the most significant aspects of this stage was the establishment of high-profile operations that would not only generate revenue but also demonstrate his authority. Each operation was meticulously planned, executed with discretion, and monitored for both profitability and security. From clandestine financial arrangements to the subtle expansion of protection networks, Serhiy ensured that his operations were both efficient and integrated into the broader structure of the criminal ecosystem. These ventures became a visible yet controlled demonstration of power, signaling to allies and rivals alike that his influence was substantial and expanding. Financial control was central to this approach. Serhiy recognized that wealth was not merely a reward, it was a mechanism for loyalty, leverage, and influence. By carefully directing resources, funding key initiatives, and strategically rewarding trusted operatives, he strengthened both internal cohesion and external reach. Allies became invested in his success, dependent not only on his protection but also on the opportunities he created. In parallel, rivals who lacked access to these resources found themselves increasingly marginalized, forced either to comply or to be sidelined by circumstances they could not control. Operations were not limited to finance. Serhiy understood that perception and influence were equally critical. Each move he made, from negotiations to interventions in disputes, was designed to reinforce his authority subtly. He created a network of oversight that allowed him to monitor both the successes and failures of operations, ensuring that any misstep could be addressed quietly, without threatening the broader perception of control. In doing so, he crafted an image of omnipresence, a leader whose awareness and judgment seemed almost intuitive, a presence felt even where he was not physically present. The management of fear and respect became a delicate balance. Serhiy cultivated an aura of authority that commanded obedience without overt intimidation, recognizing that fear alone could provoke rebellion, while respect fostered loyalty that endured beyond immediate transactions. Minor displays of decisiveness or the careful application of consequences reminded operatives and rivals alike of his control, but these gestures were always measured, never excessive. By blending psychological insight with strategic action, he ensured that his authority was both credible and enduring, rooted in competence as much as perception. High-profile operations also provided opportunities to strengthen alliances and neutralize potential threats. Serhiy selectively involved trusted operatives in critical ventures, reinforcing loyalty and demonstrating his confidence in their abilities. Simultaneously, he monitored the ambitions and behaviors of rivals, identifying those who might pose challenges and either co-opting, marginalizing, or subtly undermining them. Each operation thus became both a test of competence and a mechanism for reinforcing the network of loyalty that underpinned his growing empire. Subtlety remained a guiding principle. Serhiy avoided overt displays that might provoke resistance, preferring instead to orchestrate influence behind the scenes. Decisions were calculated, interventions precise, and communication carefully controlled. In doing so, he transformed routine operations into instruments of strategic reinforcement, ensuring that every action contributed to both practical outcomes and a broader consolidation of authority. Allies saw opportunity and guidance, rivals perceived inevitability and caution, and the network itself grew stronger and more resilient with each successful endeavor. The integration of intelligence gathering was also crucial. Serhiy cultivated sources within rival operations, local authorities, and the broader criminal network, creating an information flow that allowed him to anticipate threats and identify opportunities. Knowledge became a form of power that complemented physical control, enabling him to act decisively, often before challenges could manifest. This proactive approach allowed him to expand operations safely, consolidate influence, and maintain an advantage over competitors who often relied on reaction rather than calculation. As his influence over the criminal economy solidified, the subtle interplay of fear and respect became increasingly evident. Subordinates and allies were motivated by opportunity and loyalty, while rivals hesitated in the shadow of his reputation. The careful orchestration of both perception and action ensured that his authority extended beyond immediate operations, embedding itself in the culture of Moscow's underworld. Each success reinforced the next, creating a compounding effect that amplified both tangible control and psychological dominance. By the end of this phase, Serhiy Mikhailov had established himself as not only a strategist and consolidator of power but also as a master of the criminal economy itself. His operations generated revenue, secured loyalty, and reinforced his influence across Moscow's underworld. The first high-profile ventures were completed, rival factions were increasingly compliant or neutralized, and the perception of his omnipresence and strategic genius became widely acknowledged. This period laid the foundation for the next stage of his ascent, the full-scale assertion of dominance over Moscow's criminal empire, blending strategy, intelligence, and influence into a network that would redefine the city's underworld. As Serhiy Mikhailov's influence over Moscow's criminal economy became increasingly evident, his reputation began to extend beyond the immediate circles of operatives and rivals. People whispered his name in cautious tones across taverns, back rooms, and even marketplaces, speaking of a man whose intelligence, patience, and subtle orchestration of power set him apart. Unlike many in the underworld who relied solely on force or intimidation, Serhiy commanded attention through strategy, foresight, and a measured presence. This growing public reputation, though never flamboyant, carried weight. Allies felt pride and security, rivals felt hesitation and uncertainty, and the city's underworld began to recognize that a new power had quietly emerged, calculated, patient, and almost untouchable. The emergence of fear among rivals was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. They observed his interventions, noted the precision with which conflicts were resolved, and understood that his awareness seemed far-reaching. Minor skirmishes, previously dismissed, were now handled with methodical decisiveness that made opponents question their own competence. This subtle psychological pressure became one of Serhiy's most effective tools. Fear was not enforced through violence alone, it was cultivated through perception, patience, and the demonstration of foresight that made challenges appear futile. His reputation for anticipating moves and outmaneuvering competitors created a quiet authority that extended beyond his immediate operations. The consolidation of the underworld at this stage relied heavily on strategic manipulation of alliances. Serhiy understood that loyalty was fluid, often dependent on opportunity, respect, and perceived competence. He cultivated relationships carefully, rewarding those who demonstrated skill, reliability, and discretion while marginalizing those who posed potential threats or proved unreliable. By embedding himself within networks of dependency and influence, he ensured that his reach extended beyond his immediate circle of operatives. Allies became invested in his continued success, while rivals faced the slow erosion of autonomy, subtly pressured into alignment or sidelined without open confrontation. Operations continued to serve as both practical ventures and psychological instruments. Smuggling, protection schemes, and clandestine financial arrangements were managed with precision, but their broader significance extended beyond profit. Each operation reinforced perception, demonstrated competence, and provided opportunities to consolidate influence. Serhiy's ability to integrate economic control with strategic oversight allowed him to expand authority without the need for overt displays of force. The careful orchestration of success, visibility, and discretion created a self-reinforcing system that strengthened both internal cohesion and external dominance. During this period, Serhiy also became increasingly adept at identifying and exploiting rival weaknesses. Whether through observation of personal ambition, overextension, or internal discontent within opposing factions, he could intervene strategically to neutralize threats before they manifested as crises. These interventions were rarely direct, they were executed subtly, with a combination of psychological pressure, strategic alliances, and manipulation of circumstances. In doing so, he maintained the appearance of calm authority while systematically consolidating his influence, leaving rivals uncertain of both his capabilities and intentions. The emergence of fear and respect among both allies and rivals was intertwined with Serhiy's careful management of perception. He projected calm confidence, even in the most volatile situations, while allowing subtle indicators of unpredictability or decisiveness to reinforce authority. Allies were reassured by his judgment and composure, rivals were unsettled by the sense that every move was anticipated and every contingency accounted for. This balance of visibility and subtlety became a hallmark of his approach, ensuring that influence was durable, self-reinforcing, and difficult to challenge openly. As the city's underworld began to acknowledge his growing dominance, Serhiy also took steps to institutionalize his authority. Key figures were placed in roles that ensured loyalty, operations were streamlined for efficiency and discretion, and information networks were expanded to monitor developments across territories and factions. The integration of these elements, psychological insight, operational control, and strategic positioning, allowed him to consolidate authority not only over immediate rivals but also across a broader network of influence that spanned the city. The careful orchestration of public perception also extended to interactions with figures outside his immediate sphere. Law enforcement, politicians, and community influencers were observed and managed with subtlety, creating an environment in which his presence was both respected and difficult to challenge. By balancing discretion with strategic visibility, he cultivated a form of authority that transcended conventional measures of power, blending influence, perception, and psychological leverage into a seamless web that reinforced his control over Moscow's criminal landscape. During this stage, Serhiy's first high-profile consolidation operations were executed with precision. Territories previously contested by rival factions were brought under his influence through a combination of negotiation, strategic placement of loyal operatives, and selective pressure on dissenters. These operations demonstrated not only practical control but also strategic brilliance, further amplifying his reputation. The subtlety with which these consolidations were achieved reinforced the perception that Serhiy's reach was pervasive, calculated, and almost invisible until fully realized. By the end of this period, the emergence of fear and respect was unmistakable. Allies moved with confidence and loyalty, rivals hesitated and recalibrated their strategies, and the structure of Moscow's underworld had begun to bend to his influence. Serhiy Mikhailov had successfully transformed perception into a strategic tool, consolidating his authority not only through operations and alliances but also through the quiet power of psychological insight, foresight, and disciplined orchestration. The stage was now set for the next phase, the expansion of his empire into full-scale dominance, where influence, wealth, and fear would intertwine to define a legacy that would shape Moscow's criminal landscape for years to come. By the time Serhiy Mikhailov had solidified his reputation for strategic brilliance and quiet dominance, the city's criminal landscape was already beginning to reflect his growing influence. Rival factions, once bold and independent, now approached interactions with caution, measuring every move and reassessing alliances. Serhiy understood that the next stage of his ascent would require a careful balance, full-scale expansion of control over Moscow's criminal territories, unification of disparate factions under his influence, and the subtle, psychological assertion of dominance that would ensure compliance without open confrontation. The expansion into new territories was methodical, executed with precision and foresight. Serhiy did not simply seize control through overt displays of power, he observed, assessed, and targeted opportunities where influence could be extended with minimal risk. Certain districts were negotiated into alignment through alliances and loyalty agreements, while others were subtly pressured into compliance by demonstrating the futility of resistance. Through these strategies, he began to weave a network of influence that spanned the city, embedding his authority into both operations and perception. Unifying rival factions required more than strategic placement and alliances, it demanded a deep understanding of human behavior, ambition, and psychology. Serhiy carefully assessed the motivations of rival leaders, identifying those who could be co-opted, those who could be neutralized, and those whose ambitions required subtle management. By leveraging incentives, fostering loyalty, and selectively applying pressure, he created a sense of inevitability that drew rivals toward alignment. Resistance became impractical, and even potential challengers found themselves gradually absorbed into a system where compliance offered opportunity and defiance carried risk. Operational control was a critical component of this unification. Serhiy ensured that key activities, smuggling, protection schemes, gambling, and clandestine trade, were overseen by trusted lieutenants who were carefully positioned to maintain loyalty while maximizing efficiency. Each operation was integrated into a broader network of influence, allowing resources, information, and personnel to flow seamlessly across territories. This not only enhanced profitability but also reinforced the perception that Serhiy's reach was both comprehensive and precise, leaving little room for rivals to maneuver independently. Psychological dominance played a subtle yet crucial role. Serhiy's presence was felt even in his absence. Allies operated with confidence, understanding that decisions were guided by foresight and fairness, while rivals hesitated, aware that every move was anticipated and every vulnerability could be exploited. The careful management of perception, through measured action, strategic communication, and the selective demonstration of decisiveness, reinforced his authority. In the minds of Moscow's underworld, Serhiy Mikhailov had become a figure whose influence seemed omnipresent, calculated, and unassailable. Strategic patience remained central to every action. Expansion was not rushed, each integration of territory or faction was tested, observed, and adjusted according to circumstances. Serhiy recognized that haste could provoke conflict, fracture alliances, or expose vulnerabilities. By approaching consolidation incrementally, he ensured that each success reinforced his authority, strengthened loyalty, and created momentum for further expansion. This patience allowed him to absorb challenges quietly, turning potential threats into opportunities for influence rather than sources of disruption. Financial oversight continued to underpin his expansion. Control over revenue-generating operations provided leverage over both allies and rivals, ensuring that loyalty was reinforced through dependence and opportunity. By directing resources carefully, rewarding competence, and strategically withholding benefits from those who resisted alignment, Serhiy strengthened both internal cohesion and external compliance. Money became more than profit, it became a tool of influence, a measure of authority, and a mechanism for sustaining the empire he was building. Subtle orchestration of rival behavior was also key. Serhiy rarely engaged in overt confrontation unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he manipulated circumstances, alliances, and perception to achieve compliance and minimize risk. Competitors were often neutralized not through direct conflict, but through strategic alignment, subtle pressure, or the creation of dependencies that made resistance impractical. In doing so, he extended his reach with minimal exposure, allowing influence to grow organically while maintaining control over the broader landscape. By the end of this period, Moscow's criminal territories were increasingly unified under Serhiy's subtle yet pervasive authority. Allies moved with confidence, rivals hesitated, and the network of operations, loyalty, and perception had been woven into a cohesive system that reinforced his dominance. The city's underworld was no longer a collection of independent factions vying for control, it had become a structured ecosystem shaped, directed, and overseen by a strategist whose patience, foresight, and psychological insight had allowed him to consolidate power with remarkable efficiency. This stage marked a transformation in Serhiy Mikhailov's career. He had moved beyond the role of rising strategist or shrewd operator to become the architect of a citywide criminal empire. The careful expansion of territory, the unification of rival factions, and the subtle assertion of psychological dominance had created an environment in which compliance, loyalty, and respect were natural outcomes. His authority was no longer merely functional, it had become systemic, embedded in the operations, structures, and perceptions that governed Moscow's underworld. As he stood at this point in his ascent, Serhiy's influence was both profound and invisible. He had demonstrated that true power did not require constant displays of force, it required strategy, foresight, and the quiet orchestration of human behavior and operational networks. The consolidation of Moscow's territories was not simply a milestone, it was the foundation for a legacy, a carefully constructed empire in which control, influence, and perception intertwined seamlessly to define dominance that would be difficult to challenge. As Serhiy Mikhailov's influence extended across Moscow's criminal landscape, his public reputation began to crystallize. Whispers of his strategic brilliance, careful orchestration of power, and near-omniscient awareness circulated not only among operatives and rival factions but also throughout the broader underworld. Unlike many figures who relied solely on displays of force, Serhiy's authority was defined by subtlety, foresight, and the quiet manipulation of perception. He did not need to boast or make himself visible, his presence was felt in the way alliances shifted, disputes were resolved, and territories gradually came under his influence. In the calm, shadowed corners of the city, a new reality was taking shape, one in which his authority was both respected and feared. The emergence of fear among the criminal network was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Rivals who had once acted with confidence now hesitated, carefully considering every move and reassessing long-held assumptions. Small, seemingly minor events, an operation resolved without visible intervention, a sudden shift in allegiance, or a subtle advantage in negotiations, were interpreted as evidence of Serhiy's awareness and reach. Fear, in this context, was less about immediate threat and more about the realization that every action was being observed, anticipated, and subtly guided. This psychological influence became a powerful tool, reinforcing compliance without the need for overt displays of violence or intimidation. Public influence, while subtle, was carefully cultivated. Serhiy understood that perception shaped reality in the underworld. Allies and competitors alike monitored his actions, weighing decisions, timing, and interventions. By maintaining calm authority and responding with measured decisiveness, he created the impression of omniscience. Small, deliberate gestures, such as attending to an operative's concerns, resolving disputes efficiently, or demonstrating awareness of rival movements, were amplified through reputation and rumor, extending his influence beyond direct interactions. The result was a perception of control that few dared to question. The consolidation of power at this stage relied heavily on a combination of strategic alliances, subtle coercion, and economic leverage. Key factions were either absorbed or neutralized through negotiation and carefully applied pressure. Loyalty was rewarded with opportunity, while resistance became increasingly impractical. Serhiy's understanding of human behavior allowed him to anticipate ambition, fear, and greed, turning these traits into levers of influence. Allies grew increasingly dependent on his guidance, while rivals recalibrated their actions to avoid confrontation, reinforcing the systemic authority he had quietly established. Operations continued to serve as both practical ventures and instruments of perception. Protection schemes, smuggling, gambling networks, and financial arrangements were all managed with precision, ensuring profitability while simultaneously signaling strategic oversight. Each successful operation strengthened loyalty and demonstrated competence, subtly reinforcing the psychological dominance he wielded. Even those who did not directly interact with Serhiy came to recognize the influence of his decisions, the reach of his network, and the meticulous planning that underpinned his authority. Fear and respect were intertwined in the criminal psyche during this period. Allies were reassured by the consistency, foresight, and fairness of his leadership, while rivals were unnerved by the sense of inevitability that seemed to accompany his actions. Minor interventions were amplified through perception, creating a sense of omnipresence that reinforced compliance. Serhiy's subtle orchestration of events allowed him to expand influence across multiple factions simultaneously, consolidating authority without provoking open conflict. In this environment, obedience was not forced, it emerged naturally as the rational choice. As his public reputation grew, Serhiy also paid close attention to the structure of his operations. Trusted lieutenants were positioned strategically to oversee territories, ensure loyalty, and manage resources efficiently. Intelligence networks were expanded, providing insight into rival movements, potential threats, and opportunities for further consolidation. Each decision was carefully considered, accounting for both immediate outcomes and long-term implications. This approach ensured that Moscow's criminal network was not only under his control but also resilient, adaptive, and aligned with his strategic vision. Strategic patience remained central. Serhiy did not rush the consolidation of influence, each step was measured, observed, and refined to minimize risk. Territories were integrated incrementally, alliances strengthened subtly, and rival behavior shaped gradually. By allowing influence to grow organically while maintaining oversight, he created a foundation of authority that was both durable and difficult to challenge. The combination of patience, foresight, and subtle psychological control became the hallmark of his leadership, setting him apart from contemporaries who relied on force, intimidation, or spectacle. By the conclusion of this phase, Serhiy Mikhailov's reputation as a silent yet unassailable power had become firmly established. Moscow's underworld recognized his authority not merely through operations or alliances, but through perception, reputation, and psychological dominance. Allies operated with confidence, rivals hesitated, and the network of influence, loyalty, and observation formed a system that reinforced his control. Fear and respect were carefully balanced, creating an environment in which compliance and cooperation emerged naturally, and the seeds of his eventual complete dominion over the city were firmly sown. In this period, the first true signs of a legacy began to emerge. Serhiy had demonstrated that leadership in the criminal underworld was not defined by overt power or noise, but by foresight, strategy, and the quiet orchestration of human and operational dynamics. Moscow had begun to bend, subtly and irrevocably, to his influence. The stage was now set for the next chapter, a further intensification of control, where influence, intimidation, and respect would converge to solidify his position as the city's unspoken ruler, a figure whose reach would extend into every corner of the criminal landscape. Despite the carefully orchestrated consolidation of Moscow's criminal territories and the subtle cultivation of fear and respect, Serhiy Mikhailov soon faced his first direct confrontation with a significant rival, a test that would challenge not only his operational authority but also his psychological mastery over the underworld. The rival in question was a formidable figure, known for audacity and cunning, whose ambition had previously been underestimated. Unlike the minor skirmishes Serhiy had navigated earlier, this confrontation carried the potential for visible conflict, disruption of alliances, and the destabilization of operations. It was a moment where strategy, foresight, and patience would collide with ambition, pride, and the chaotic unpredictability of human behavior. Serhiy approached the confrontation with characteristic calm and calculation. He had learned that raw aggression rarely produced durable outcomes. Influence required subtlety, manipulation of perception, and timing. The first step was observation, analyzing his rival's network, patterns of behavior, motivations, and weaknesses. He studied the rival's past decisions, the alliances they had cultivated, and the ways in which their ambition might be leveraged or redirected. By understanding the psychology of his opponent, Serhiy prepared not just to counter moves but to anticipate them, shaping events in a way that made resistance seem impractical or even self-defeating. The confrontation began with subtle maneuvers rather than open conflict. Serhiy deployed loyal operatives strategically, allowing the rival to perceive influence without understanding its full extent. Minor shifts in alliances, selective disruptions of operations, and carefully orchestrated communication created a psychological pressure that slowly eroded confidence. Rivals began to feel the weight of his presence, even in the absence of overt action. The genius of this approach lay in its subtlety. Fear was cultivated without direct violence, and the perception of inevitability reinforced compliance more effectively than brute force could. As the tension escalated, Serhiy introduced controlled negotiations and symbolic gestures of authority. He offered opportunities for collaboration to those within the rival's network, demonstrating fairness and pragmatism while simultaneously reinforcing the message that resistance carried risk. Allies observed these interactions closely, noting his ability to combine strategic leverage with measured diplomacy. Meanwhile, the rival faced a growing sense of constraint. Every move was anticipated, every contingency accounted for, and every ally gradually aligned with Serhiy's vision. The psychological impact was profound, as the rival came to understand that direct confrontation would be not only costly but strategically futile. Financial and operational leverage played a critical role. Serhiy subtly redirected resources, aligned profitable ventures with loyal operatives, and created dependencies within the rival's network. Money, opportunity, and influence became instruments of control, reinforcing compliance without overt coercion. Rivals who resisted experienced marginalization, loss of access to critical operations, and increasing isolation. Each of these interventions was carefully calibrated to maintain the perception of fairness while ensuring that resistance became increasingly untenable. By blending foresight, psychological insight, and operational control, Serhiy transformed a potentially volatile confrontation into a demonstration of authority. The rival, initially confident and assertive, was gradually guided into alignment with his objectives. Resistance was replaced by accommodation, defiance by cautious cooperation. Through patience, observation, and the strategic orchestration of perception, Serhiy achieved dominance without publicized violence or open conflict, reinforcing the broader lesson that true power in the underworld was subtle, systemic, and rooted in foresight rather than spectacle. The confrontation also highlighted the importance of internal cohesion. Serhiy's operatives were not only tasked with executing strategic moves but also maintaining loyalty and morale throughout the network. Clear communication, trust, and disciplined execution ensured that every member understood their role, the stakes involved, and the benefits of alignment. By reinforcing internal stability, he guaranteed that external confrontations would be managed smoothly, reducing the risk of unexpected setbacks or fractures within his own operations. Strategic patience remained a guiding principle throughout. Rather than forcing a rapid resolution, Serhiy allowed events to unfold in a controlled manner, ensuring that every intervention created cumulative advantages. Each step, from observation to subtle pressure to negotiation, contributed to a narrative in which compliance appeared rational and defiance irrational. By the time the confrontation reached its conclusion, the rivals' options had been methodically narrowed, and alignment with Serhiy's authority emerged as the natural course. This episode solidified his psychological dominance across Moscow's underworld. Allies witnessed the effectiveness of his approach, reinforcing trust and loyalty. Rivals learned, through both observation and experience, that his strategic foresight and subtle orchestration made resistance futile. The confrontation became a model for how Serhiy would manage power, not through force alone, but through the quiet manipulation of circumstances, perception, and human behavior. It demonstrated that authority could be established as much through anticipation and patience as through action. By the end of this confrontation, Serhiy Mikhailov had not only neutralized a significant threat but also reinforced the perception of his invincibility. Moscow's criminal network had observed a masterclass in psychological and operational dominance, subtle, deliberate, and effective. Fear and respect were carefully balanced, alliances were strengthened, and his position as the city's unspoken ruler was further solidified. The groundwork was laid for the next phase of his ascent, where strategic dominance, expansion of influence, and systemic control would converge to define his empire and cement his legacy as one of Moscow's most formidable underworld figures. With his first major rival neutralized and alignment across Moscow's criminal territories increasingly solidified, Serhiy Mikhailov reached a new phase of his ascent, the peak of his power. At this stage, his influence was no longer confined to localized networks or individual factions, it extended across the entire underworld ecosystem. Operations, alliances, intelligence networks, and perceptions of authority had all been carefully cultivated to create a system in which his control was both pervasive and subtle. The city's criminal landscape now moved in rhythm with his strategy, almost as if an invisible hand guided decisions, disputes, and interactions across the network. This period of dominance was characterized by the seamless orchestration of multiple facets of influence. Serhiy continued to oversee operations, ensuring that every smuggling route, protection scheme, gambling network, and clandestine financial venture was functioning efficiently and in alignment with his broader objectives. Yet he understood that true power was more than operational control, it required the psychological integration of fear, respect, and loyalty. Allies were reinforced through recognition, opportunity, and strategic reward, while potential threats were managed through anticipation, subtle pressure, and the careful creation of dependencies that made resistance impractical. The psychological dimension of power became increasingly apparent. Serhiy had learned that fear, respect, and admiration could be intertwined to produce compliance without visible coercion. Rivals hesitated before challenging his decisions, unsure whether open defiance would succeed or fail. Allies moved with confidence, trusting in his foresight and judgment. Even casual observers within the underworld, those who were not directly involved in operations, recognized a quiet authority that seemed almost omnipresent. The careful balance between intimidation and benevolence created a network in which obedience and cooperation emerged naturally, reinforcing the structure of power without the need for constant enforcement. Financial and resource management remained central to this peak period. Serhiy had perfected the distribution of opportunity and wealth, ensuring that loyal operatives and allied factions benefited from alignment while isolating those who resisted. This strategic allocation not only reinforced loyalty but also created interdependencies that bound networks to his influence. Money, protection, and access to lucrative operations became instruments of compliance, while strategic withholding or redirection subtly constrained rivals' options. In this way, economic control intertwined seamlessly with psychological influence, producing a system that was difficult to challenge or disrupt. The consolidation of his empire also relied on information mastery. Serhiy expanded intelligence networks across Moscow, gathering insights on rival movements, potential threats, and shifts in loyalty. Knowledge became a currency of power, allowing him to anticipate conflicts, intervene subtly, and guide decisions across the network. Information flows were carefully controlled, and operatives were positioned to provide strategic awareness without compromising loyalty or operational efficiency. By integrating intelligence with influence and resources, he achieved a level of dominance that extended beyond territory into perception and behavior itself. At the peak of his power, Serhiy also refined the art of symbolic authority. Strategic gestures, whether the resolution of a dispute, a decisive operational move, or a measured act of discipline, were observed across the network and interpreted as signs of skill, foresight, and inevitability. Allies took reassurance from these demonstrations, while rivals recognized the futility of open opposition. By blending subtlety with symbolism, he created a psychological landscape in which his presence was felt everywhere, even when he remained physically absent. Authority was thus both operational and psychological, woven into the fabric of the city's criminal ecosystem. Expansion during this period was not aggressive in a traditional sense, it was calculated, deliberate, and integrated into the larger framework of systemic control. New territories, previously contested by minor factions or loosely organized groups, were brought into alignment through negotiation, strategic alliances, and selective application of pressure. Each integration reinforced both the perception and reality of Serhiy's dominance, demonstrating that his influence extended across Moscow without necessitating widespread conflict or overt displays of force. The city's underworld had become a network in which his guidance shaped outcomes almost invisibly, yet decisively. Internal cohesion remained a critical factor. Loyal operatives were carefully cultivated, with roles assigned based on competence, reliability, and alignment with his vision. Discipline, discretion, and coordination were emphasized, ensuring that the network could respond effectively to challenges while maintaining a unified front. Subordinates recognized the stability and opportunity that alignment with Serhiy provided, reinforcing trust, loyalty, and efficiency. Internal strength ensured that external dominance was sustainable, creating a system in which influence could be exercised reliably across all levels of the organization. The interplay of fear and respect reached its zenith during this phase. Allies moved with confidence and initiative, knowing that strategic guidance and oversight were always present. Rivals, both observed and unobserved, hesitated, aware that any misstep could be anticipated and addressed. The subtle orchestration of perception reinforced compliance, and even indirect observers acknowledged the authority that Serhiy commanded. Fear was tempered by recognition of skill, loyalty was reinforced through opportunity, and respect became a natural response to consistent foresight and effective strategy. By the end of this period, Serhiy Mikhailov had achieved a level of dominance rarely seen in Moscow's criminal history. His empire was both extensive and resilient, his influence both tangible and psychological. He had demonstrated that leadership was not defined by noise or force but by patience, foresight, and the orchestration of human behavior, resources, and perception. Allies were secure, rivals cautious, and the underworld itself had become a structured ecosystem shaped by his strategy. At this peak, Serhiy stood as an almost invisible ruler, whose reach extended into every corner of the city's criminal operations, establishing the foundation for both enduring influence and an eventual legacy. Even at the peak of his power, Serhiy Mikhailov was keenly aware that dominance in the underworld was never permanent. The vast empire he had meticulously constructed across Moscow's criminal landscape was impressive in both scale and influence, yet it required constant vigilance to sustain. Every operation, every alliance, and every decision contributed to a delicate balance of fear, loyalty, and perception. He understood that power, once established, is fragile, an intricate system of dependencies that could collapse under the weight of betrayal, mismanagement, or shifting ambition. The first signs of strain were subtle, manifesting in operational delays and minor lapses in discipline. Territories that had once been secure began to show small signs of inefficiency, shipments arriving late, communications mismanaged, and minor conflicts between operatives emerging unexpectedly. Individually, these incidents were not catastrophic, yet Serhiy understood them as early indicators of potential instability. In a criminal empire of this magnitude, even seemingly trivial disruptions could ripple outward, undermining cohesion and emboldening rivals. He approached these early signs with measured attention, investigating quietly, observing patterns, and addressing lapses with subtle reinforcement rather than overt punishment. Paranoia, though it might sound excessive to outsiders, became an essential tool for survival. Serhiy's awareness of the fragility of power heightened with every passing day. He knew that perception was as critical as actual control. Any hint of weakness could be magnified by rumor or opportunistic rivals. Even minor hesitations from trusted allies were scrutinized, and every interaction was evaluated for possible hidden motives. This heightened vigilance, though mentally taxing, allowed him to anticipate threats before they materialized and act decisively to mitigate them, often without anyone realizing intervention had occurred. Internal tensions became more pronounced as his empire expanded. Loyal operatives, once unquestioning in their compliance, occasionally displayed signs of dissatisfaction. Ambition, fatigue, and envy began to influence decisions, subtly challenging the cohesion that had once seemed unshakable. Serhiy recognized the delicate nature of loyalty. It was not a static quality but a dynamic relationship that required ongoing cultivation. To maintain allegiance, he relied on a combination of psychological insight, strategic communication, and the careful distribution of rewards and recognition. Punishment was applied sparingly, reserved for those whose actions posed a tangible threat to stability, ensuring that fear complemented loyalty rather than undermining it. Rival factions began to sense cracks in his armor. Though outwardly compliant, competitors observed subtle signs of vulnerability, minor operational lapses, hints of dissatisfaction among operatives, and small shifts in strategic alignment. These rivals did not act recklessly. Their probing was deliberate, cautious, and calculated. They tested boundaries, explored opportunities for collaboration with disloyal operatives, and quietly expanded their influence. For Serhiy, these early challenges were both predictable and instructive, reinforcing the necessity of constant vigilance and adaptive strategy. Operational efficiency, once a hallmark of his empire, required more active management than ever. Previously reliable smuggling routes, protection networks, and revenue streams now demanded careful monitoring to prevent minor disruptions from escalating into significant crises. Serhiy deployed trusted lieutenants to oversee critical sectors, reinforced the chain of command, and created redundancies to reduce vulnerability. Yet he knew that no system, however well designed, could eliminate the unpredictable variables introduced by human behavior and ambition. The complexity of managing both operational and psychological stability increased exponentially with the scale of the empire. The subtle erosion of perception was perhaps the most insidious threat. Throughout his rise, Serhiy had cultivated an aura of inevitability, a presence that suggested omniscience and unassailable authority. This perception reinforced loyalty, deterred rivals, and maintained cohesion across the network. Yet even minor lapses, if observed and interpreted strategically by allies or competitors, could diminish this carefully constructed image. Serhiy understood that sustaining authority required not just operational control but the continuous management of perception, ensuring that fear, respect, and loyalty remained intertwined in the minds of those around him. Financial management, too, became a delicate task. Resources once easily leveraged to reward loyalty, fund operations, and reinforce influence were increasingly strained. Diversion, mismanagement, and the ambitions of ambitious operatives introduced vulnerabilities into revenue streams that had previously been stable. Serhiy recognized that economic power was intertwined with social and psychological control. The perception of wealth and resourcefulness reinforced authority, while instability in finances could embolden rivals and unsettle allies. As a result, meticulous oversight of both resources and perception became essential for maintaining empire-wide cohesion. The convergence of these internal and external pressures created an environment of constant tension. Allies navigated uncertainty, attempting to balance personal ambition with loyalty. Rivals probed cautiously, waiting for mistakes or visible cracks to exploit. Even peripheral observers sensed the fragility, creating a landscape in which each interaction and decision carried disproportionate significance. Serhiy's genius lay not only in managing operational logistics but also in orchestrating the subtleties of human psychology, understanding motivations, anticipating behavior, and guiding outcomes without overt displays of force. Strategic patience became the cornerstone of his continued dominance. Rather than reacting impulsively to every challenge, Serhiy relied on observation, calculated intervention, and subtle reinforcement of loyalty. Minor breaches were addressed quietly, negotiations mediated subtly, and threats neutralized before they could escalate. Every move was designed to maintain the equilibrium of the empire, preserving perception while managing reality. Yet the mental load of constant evaluation, foresight, and decision-making was immense, requiring a discipline and focus that few could sustain over decades. As the first significant signs of potential decline became more visible, Serhiy understood that his empire's resilience would be tested not by external forces alone, but by the interplay of human ambition, operational strain, and psychological complexity. The structures of loyalty, fear, and respect that had underpinned dominance were now subject to scrutiny, negotiation, and subtle rebellion. Allies whose loyalty had been assumed were now observed more closely, and the smallest misstep could trigger cascading consequences across multiple sectors of the empire. The challenge was amplified by the increasing assertiveness of rivals. While previously deterred by the perception of invincibility, competitors now sensed opportunity in the subtle disruptions within his network. Encroachments, quiet negotiations with disloyal operatives, and testing of boundaries introduced uncertainty into a system that had relied on disciplined compliance. Serhiy's capacity to maintain control required constant adaptation, preemptive action, and an acute awareness of both operational and psychological variables. By the end of this period, Serhiy had established that while the empire remained powerful and influential, its sustainability required heightened vigilance, strategic foresight, and nuanced management of perception. The minor cracks observed earlier had grown, yet they remained manageable under his careful guidance. The lessons of this stage were clear: dominance is fragile, loyalty is conditional, and perception is as critical as reality. Serhiy's genius allowed him to navigate these complexities, but he was acutely aware that future challenges could be even more unpredictable and difficult to control. He now faced a landscape where the margin for error was narrower than ever. Every decision, every action, and every interaction required careful evaluation not only of immediate consequences but also of long-term implications. Allies, rivals, and even peripheral actors could influence outcomes in unpredictable ways, and the perception of strength remained essential to preserving authority. The intricate balance of loyalty, fear, operational control, and strategic foresight had never been more delicate, demanding constant attention, mental acuity, and psychological insight. In essence, this period was a prelude to the empire's eventual challenges, a phase where Serhiy's mastery was both tested and demonstrated. He retained the ability to influence, command, and intervene decisively, yet he recognized the fragility of his position and the inevitability of future crises. The subtle cracks in loyalty, operational efficiency, and perception were reminders that even the most carefully constructed empires are susceptible to the pressures of ambition, human behavior, and circumstance. His vigilance, patience, and strategic acumen remained the defining factors that would determine whether his empire could withstand these emerging pressures. By the conclusion of this stage, it was clear that the empire, though still powerful and influential, required continuous, careful management to maintain stability. The interplay of human ambition, operational complexity, and psychological perception had created a fragile ecosystem in which the margin for error was minimal. Serhiy Mikhailov's continued dominance depended not on brute force alone but on the subtle orchestration of loyalty, fear, and perception, a delicate equilibrium that, if disrupted, could alter the trajectory of his empire in ways both profound and irreversible. The first unmistakable signs that Serhiy Mikhailov's empire was entering a period of instability appeared not in grand upheaval, but in small, almost imperceptible shifts. Operations that had previously run like clockwork now began to experience delays. Smuggling routes, once seamless, encountered interruptions. Protection rackets faced unexpected disputes among operatives. Financial flows, which had always been meticulously managed, showed minor discrepancies that, though individually insignificant, collectively indicated the emergence of systemic strain. To an outsider, these might have seemed trivial, yet Serhiy, with decades of experience reading both men and operations, recognized them as early indicators of potential fracture, a signal that the balance of power was subtly shifting. Internal tensions, previously dormant, became increasingly visible. Lieutenants who had once deferred completely to Serhiy's authority began to test boundaries, asserting autonomy in small but significant ways. Decisions that had previously been made unquestioned were now met with hesitation, occasional disagreement, or quiet negotiation for personal advantage. These behaviors were subtle, often cloaked in apparent compliance, but they carried profound implications. In the delicate ecosystem of a criminal empire, minor acts of independence can ripple outward, undermining cohesion, emboldening rivals, and eroding the perception of invincibility. Betrayals, once rare and carefully concealed, became more frequent and sophisticated. Operatives began quietly negotiating with external competitors, diverting resources, and forming covert alliances. The motivations were diverse. Some sought personal enrichment, others aimed to secure position or territory in anticipation of future instability. The most dangerous betrayals were those that combined subtlety with foresight, executed in ways that concealed intent until their impact was unavoidable. Serhiy's keen perception allowed him to identify these threats early, but addressing them required strategic precision. Overly harsh measures risked alienating loyalists, while inaction could embolden further disloyalty. The psychological environment within the empire began to shift under these pressures. Fear, which had been a stabilizing force ensuring compliance, now carried the weight of uncertainty. Operatives questioned the security of their positions, assessing whether loyalty remained advantageous or safe. Rivals, sensing cracks, probed boundaries cautiously, testing the limits of influence without provoking direct confrontation. Even peripheral observers noticed the subtle changes in the network, noting that the once unshakable aura of authority surrounding Serhiy had softened in the face of these emerging pressures. Operational challenges compounded these psychological strains. Previously dependable smuggling channels, financial systems, and enforcement networks required more oversight than ever. Minor lapses, if left unaddressed, had the potential to escalate into significant operational failures. Serhiy deployed trusted lieutenants to monitor critical sectors, introduced redundancies to reduce vulnerability, and applied strategic interventions to prevent disruption. Yet the inherent unpredictability of human behavior meant that no system, however well designed, could fully safeguard against error or ambition. Every decision carried compounded risk, as a single misstep could cascade into broader instability across multiple layers of the empire. Financial management, which had long served as both a tool and a symbol of authority, became increasingly delicate. Resources once efficiently leveraged to reward loyalty and fund operations were now vulnerable to diversion, mismanagement, and the ambitions of individual operatives. This erosion of economic control had psychological ramifications. Perception of scarcity or weakness emboldened rivals and prompted questioning among allies. Serhiy recognized that wealth and influence were not merely operational tools but psychological instruments, reinforcing loyalty, demonstrating capacity, and sustaining fear, and that any perceived weakening could have disproportionate consequences. The interplay of ambition, betrayal, and operational strain created a complex, fragile ecosystem within the empire. Loyalists, uncertain of stability, occasionally hesitated or acted independently. Rivals carefully observed the unfolding dynamics, looking for signs of weakness that could be exploited. Even the perception of Serhiy's omniscience, which had been a cornerstone of his authority, was beginning to be subtly challenged. Where once his decisions were unquestioned, they were now examined, second-guessed, and sometimes strategically circumvented. The delicate equilibrium that had maintained cohesion for years was under constant stress, requiring nuanced intervention at every level. Psychological strategy became more critical than ever. Serhiy understood that maintaining authority was not solely a matter of operational control, but also of managing perception. Subtle demonstrations of power, carefully timed rewards, and selective interventions were employed to reinforce loyalty and deter disloyalty without provoking unnecessary resentment. The balance was fragile. Overreaction could create new fractures, while underreaction might signal weakness. Navigating this landscape demanded not only strategic acumen but also deep insight into human behavior, ambition, and the subtleties of influence. External pressures magnified these internal challenges. Rivals outside Moscow's criminal network sensed opportunity in the empire's subtle instability. Encroachments into previously secure territories, discreet negotiations with disloyal operatives, and the strategic testing of boundaries all increased the complexity of Serhiy's operational environment. Law enforcement, too, exploited these vulnerabilities, intercepting financial flows, monitoring communication channels, and acting on intelligence that previously would have been irrelevant or unnoticed. The convergence of internal fractures and external pressures introduced a level of unpredictability that required constant adaptation. Strategic patience, once a hallmark of his operational philosophy, became both a necessity and a challenge. Serhiy could no longer rely solely on established patterns of compliance or fear. Each intervention required careful assessment, precise timing, and consideration of both immediate and long-term consequences. Minor disruptions were addressed subtly to avoid unnecessary alarm, while more significant challenges were neutralized with discretion and precision. This delicate orchestration demanded continuous mental engagement, resilience, and the ability to anticipate human behavior across multiple dimensions simultaneously. As operational strains intensified, the perception of authority became increasingly important. The appearance of control, decisiveness, and omniscience had long reinforced loyalty and deterred rivals. Now, even the subtlest hint of indecision or miscalculation could embolden opponents and unsettle allies. Maintaining this perception required calculated actions that often masked the underlying complexity and fragility of the system. Serhiy's ability to project confidence and inevitability, even as challenges multiplied behind the scenes, was critical to preserving cohesion and delaying further destabilization. By the midpoint of this phase, the empire's fragility was unmistakable, though it remained functional. Operations continued, territories were maintained, and the network of alliances endured, but the underlying structure was increasingly strained. Minor cracks in loyalty, operational inefficiencies, and subtle misperceptions combined to create a volatile environment in which stability was conditional and constant vigilance was essential. Serhiy's genius lay in recognizing these pressures early, intervening strategically, and sustaining the empire's functionality despite the growing fragility. The narrative of this stage illustrates the delicate interplay between human ambition, operational complexity, and perception. Serhiy's empire, like any complex system, was subject to both predictable and unpredictable pressures. Loyalty was dynamic, fear was conditional, and perception could either reinforce or undermine authority. The subtle erosion of these factors introduced risk, yet careful management and psychological insight allowed Serhiy to navigate the emerging challenges. He preserved influence, managed disloyalty, and deterred rivals, demonstrating a mastery of both operational and psychological strategy that few could rival. By the end of this period, it was clear that while the empire remained powerful and influential, it was increasingly dependent on active management, vigilance, and strategic foresight. The subtle cracks observed in loyalty, operations, and perception were manageable but required constant attention. Serhiy's continued ability to maintain cohesion would determine whether the empire could withstand future challenges or whether decline, inevitable in the life cycle of any human institution, would accelerate. This period of careful observation, adaptation, and strategic intervention set the stage for the eventual challenges that would fully test the resilience of both the empire and the man who had built it. The once unshakable foundations of Serhiy Mikhailov's empire were beginning to tremble under the combined weight of internal betrayal, rival opportunism, and the pressures of sustaining control over an extensive criminal network. In the earlier phases of his rise, subtle manipulations, psychological dominance, and operational mastery had sufficed to secure loyalty and maintain fear. But now, cracks in trust and perception were widening. Allies who had once followed him without hesitation began to question his decisions, act independently, or seek alternative avenues for personal gain. The web of influence that had seemed seamless and unassailable was now strained, revealing vulnerabilities that could, and soon would, be exploited. The betrayal of key lieutenants marked the most dangerous phase of this decline. Individuals who had once been entrusted with overseeing critical operations began quietly negotiating with rivals, redirecting resources, and withholding vital information. Some sought personal enrichment, others attempted to expand their own influence under the guise of loyalty. These betrayals were rarely overt. They manifested as delays, miscommunications, or subtle shifts in alignment. Yet their cumulative impact eroded operational efficiency, weakened perception of control, and amplified uncertainty across the empire. Serhiy, ever vigilant, recognized the signs and acted decisively, but the complexity and scale of his network meant that not every fracture could be addressed immediately. Rivals seized on these subtle vulnerabilities with increasing boldness. Encroachment into previously secure territories, discreet formation of alliances, and calculated disruptions of operations signaled a new era of challenge. While Serhiy's influence remained significant, the perception of invincibility that had once deterred competition began to falter. Opponents realized that cracks existed, and they probed relentlessly, testing boundaries, negotiating quietly with disloyal operatives, and seeking opportunities to weaken his authority. The environment of controlled inevitability that had defined his empire was shifting toward uncertainty, tension, and subtle conflict. Financial and operational pressures compounded the problem. Resources previously allocated efficiently now faced mismanagement, theft, or diversion. Smuggling operations experienced interruptions, protection schemes faced challenges, and gambling and financial ventures were disrupted by both internal and external pressures. These disturbances undermined not only revenue but also the leverage used to maintain loyalty. Economic instability translated directly into political and social instability within the underworld, making it more difficult to project authority and manage perceptions effectively. The psychological toll on Serhiy was significant. His strategic brilliance and foresight had carried him through every challenge, yet the sheer scale of these simultaneous pressures introduced a new level of complexity. Decisions that had once seemed straightforward now required delicate balancing of risk, loyalty, perception, and timing. Every intervention had to account for multiple variables: the ambitions of allies, the opportunism of rivals, the perceptions of operatives, and the fragility of operational systems. Maintaining control in this environment demanded not only skill but extraordinary mental focus, patience, and adaptability. As cracks widened, fear began to shift. Previously, fear had been a stabilizing force, ensuring compliance and reinforcing respect. Now, it took on a more volatile character. Allies and subordinates hesitated, unsure of the security of their positions. Rivals tested limits, emboldened by visible disruptions. Even peripheral observers sensed a change, noting that the previously unshakable authority of Serhiy was being challenged in ways that had not occurred during his rise. Fear, once a tool of stability, became a reflection of uncertainty, amplifying the instability that threatened to unravel the empire. Betrayals accelerated the decline as misaligned operatives shared information with rivals, redirected resources, or acted in self-interest. Each act of disloyalty was a signal to others that loyalty was negotiable, that Serhiy's authority could be challenged, and that the consequences of misalignment were now less predictable. The subtle equilibrium between fear, respect, and obedience that had maintained cohesion began to falter. Even the most trusted allies were now subject to scrutiny, and the constant need for oversight diverted attention from broader strategic objectives, creating a feedback loop of tension, mistrust, and operational strain. External pressures intensified the challenge. Rival criminal organizations outside Moscow sensed opportunity in the growing instability, pressing at borders, forming covert alliances, and testing the limits of Serhiy's influence. Law enforcement, too, became more active, exploiting vulnerabilities revealed by operational disruptions and internal betrayal. The convergence of internal fractures and external threats created a landscape in which the mechanisms that had ensured dominance were strained to their limits, demanding constant vigilance, rapid adaptation, and carefully calculated interventions. The once calculated patience and subtle orchestration that had defined Serhiy's strategy now faced constant testing. He was forced into more reactive measures, addressing crises as they emerged while attempting to maintain the overarching structure of his empire. Strategic foresight remained crucial, but unpredictability and human ambition increasingly dictated the pace and scope of his decisions. Every move required a careful balance of influence, threat, reward, and perception, leaving little room for error. By the end of this phase, the decline was undeniable. The intricate network that had defined Moscow's criminal underworld under Serhiy Mikhailov was no longer seamless. Betrayals, rival encroachments, operational missteps, and the erosion of perception had combined to destabilize the empire. Though he retained significant influence, the foundations of his authority were fragile, and the mechanisms of control that had previously ensured compliance were now under strain. The stage was set for the final chapter of his story, where the culmination of these pressures would test the resilience of both the empire and the man who had built it, bringing the narrative of rise, dominance, and eventual unraveling to its inevitable climax. The final chapter of Serhiy Mikhailov's reign was defined by a slow, inexorable unraveling rather than sudden collapse. For years, he had ruled Moscow's underworld with a combination of strategic brilliance, psychological insight, and operational mastery. His rise had been meticulously orchestrated, his empire constructed with patience, foresight, and careful manipulation of both fear and loyalty. Yet even the most carefully engineered systems are vulnerable to the pressures of human ambition, shifting alliances, and unforeseen circumstance. Now, the once unassailable edifice of his power began to show cracks that were no longer easily contained. By this stage, internal betrayal had become both frequent and sophisticated. Lieutenants who had once been extensions of his will now acted with autonomy, quietly negotiating with rivals, redirecting resources, and establishing personal spheres of influence. These acts of disloyalty were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet their cumulative effect eroded both operational cohesion and the psychological perception of authority. Serhiy recognized these betrayals early, but managing them required more than simple intervention. Each response had to be carefully calibrated. Too harsh a punishment could alienate other allies, while inaction risked encouraging further disloyalty. The balance was delicate, requiring constant assessment of human behavior, loyalty, and ambition. Rival organizations and external forces also sensed opportunity. For years, fear and respect had deterred external encroachment, but the emergence of fractures within his empire emboldened competitors. Factions from outside Moscow probed boundaries, tested loyalties, and quietly expanded influence in ways that challenged Serhiy's control. Simultaneously, law enforcement, ever vigilant, capitalized on operational vulnerabilities created by both internal betrayal and external pressure. These converging threats amplified the instability within the empire, introducing uncertainty where once there had been a controlled sense of inevitability. Operational failures, minor during his rise, now had magnified consequences. Smuggling operations were intercepted or delayed, protection schemes faltered under unexpected challenges, and financial operations experienced diversion and mismanagement. The once seamless orchestration of resources and personnel required constant attention, and even minor lapses could cascade, creating ripple effects across multiple layers of the empire. Serhiy's strategic genius was now engaged not just in building and maintaining power, but in damage control, attempting to preserve cohesion in a network increasingly fractured by human ambition and circumstance. The psychological landscape of the empire had shifted dramatically. Fear, which had been a stabilizing force reinforcing loyalty, was now tinged with uncertainty. Operatives hesitated, questioning whether their alignment remained advantageous or safe. Rivals grew bold, emboldened by signs of operational disruption and subtle fractures in loyalty. Even peripheral actors sensed change, noting that Serhiy's authority, once perceived as inevitable and omnipresent, was no longer absolute. The delicate interplay of respect, fear, and compliance that had underpinned his dominance was eroding, demanding heightened vigilance and nuanced intervention. Financial instability compounded the challenge. Resources once effectively leveraged to secure loyalty, incentivize operatives, and fund operations were now strained or misdirected. Misappropriation, diversion, and inefficiencies reduced the capacity to influence outcomes through economic means. This erosion had a ripple effect. It weakened loyalty, emboldened rivals, and magnified perceptions of vulnerability. Even the most disciplined and previously loyal operatives required reassurance, while opportunists tested the limits of authority and capacity. The mechanisms that had once guaranteed control, wealth, access, and influence, were no longer sufficient in isolation. As internal betrayal, operational failure, and external pressure converged, the subtle architecture of control Serhiy had perfected began to fray. Territories that had been secure now demanded active management. Loyalty, once intrinsic, became conditional. The perception of inevitability, a cornerstone of his power, weakened. The environment of certainty and disciplined obedience transformed into one of tension, uncertainty, and vigilance. Every decision, interaction, and negotiation now carried the weight of compounded risk, where a single miscalculation could have cascading effects across both operations and perception. The mental burden on Serhiy was immense. For decades, he had relied on foresight, psychological acumen, and meticulous planning to shape behavior and outcomes. Now, he faced the dual challenge of sustaining operational functionality while preserving the perception of authority, all under the pressure of growing disloyalty, rival aggression, and systemic instability. Constant evaluation of human behavior, potential threats, and strategic priorities became essential. Every encounter with subordinates, every negotiation with rivals, and every adjustment of operational strategy required precision, patience, and insight, leaving little margin for error. Despite the erosion of control, Serhiy's influence was not entirely extinguished. Loyalists remained, and his strategic insight still guided many operations. Rivals who misjudged the situation faced consequences, reinforcing that even in decline, the capacity for decisive action remained. However, the nature of his power had transformed. No longer unassailable, it now required continuous, painstaking effort to maintain equilibrium and prevent further fragmentation. The empire, once an extension of his strategic vision, had become a delicate ecosystem in which survival depended as much on adaptability as on strength. Reflection became a prominent theme during this stage. Serhiy understood that the measure of his legacy would not lie solely in dominance, wealth, or operational success, but in the lessons embedded within the rise and fall of his empire. He had demonstrated the power of strategy, patience, and psychological mastery. He had shown how fear, respect, and influence could shape human behavior and organizational cohesion. Yet he also confronted the limits of control, recognizing that even the most carefully constructed systems are ultimately vulnerable to human ambition, unpredictability, and circumstance. His reflections were as much about the nature of power itself as about his personal achievements. The final stage of decline was also a period of adaptation. Serhiy focused on consolidating what remained, preserving key alliances, stabilizing critical territories, and mitigating the most dangerous threats. While he could no longer enforce absolute control, he exercised strategic guidance where possible, maintaining influence through selective intervention. He remained a figure of caution and respect, a reminder to allies and rivals alike that experience, insight, and decisiveness still carried weight, even as the empire's cohesion waned. Ultimately, the narrative of Serhiy Mikhailov is a meditation on the ephemeral nature of power. Authority, no matter how meticulously constructed, is never permanent. Loyalty can shift, perception can erode, and the unpredictable dynamics of human behavior can undermine even the most disciplined and strategic networks. The rise, dominance, and decline of his empire illustrate the delicate interplay of foresight, psychology, operational mastery, and circumstance. Serhiy's genius lay in the construction of an extraordinary system of control. His legacy lies in both its achievements and the cautionary lessons embedded in its eventual unraveling. As Moscow adjusted to a post-Serhiy reality, his influence lingered. The lessons of his strategies, both successful and flawed, informed the behavior of operatives, the ambitions of rivals, and the structure of emerging criminal networks. The echoes of his empire remained, visible in both the geography of control and the psychology of those who had served under him. In the quiet corners of the city he once dominated, the memory of Serhiy Mikhailov persisted, a testament to brilliance, strategy, and the subtle, often transient nature of power itself. Even in decline, his story held the weight of history. It demonstrated that dominance is built not on force alone but on perception, foresight, and the intricate orchestration of human behavior. It illustrated that fear and respect, while powerful tools, require constant maintenance and can be eroded by the complexity and unpredictability of ambition. Finally, it offered a profound reflection on the human dimension of power, that empires are not simply structures of control but living, breathing systems shaped by the interplay of strategy, loyalty, psychology, and circumstance. The life and legacy of Serhiy Mikhailov endure as both caution and inspiration. His empire, though fractured, remains a study in meticulous strategy and human insight. His rise and fall, the consolidation of influence, the subtle art of managing fear and loyalty, and the eventual unraveling of authority provide timeless lessons on the nature of power, the fragility of empires, and the enduring complexity of the human condition. In the shadows of Moscow, the story of the Bratva boss who once made the city his kingdom continues to resonate, a narrative of ambition, dominance, subtlety, and the inevitable passage of time.